Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Wade Laramie had been hauling freight through the Pacific Northwest for the better part of 11 years, and in all that time, he'd learned to trust two things above all else: his instincts and his diesel engine. Both had kept him alive through ice storms that turned highways into skating rinks, through breakdowns in places so remote that cell towers were nothing but a fantasy, and through stretches of road where the only company was the occasional deer stupid enough to leap in front of 18 wheels of rolling steel. Wade wasn't the type to spook easily. He'd seen enough of the world from behind a windshield to know that most of the scary stories truckers told each other at rest stops were just that: stories embellished over coffee and boredom until they barely resembled whatever mundane thing had actually happened. But the night he drove through Snoqualmie Pass in early November, Wade learned that some stories don't need embellishment. Some stories write themselves in fog and diesel smoke, in the red glow of taillights that appear where no taillights should be, and in the kind of silence that makes a man question whether he's still on the same highway he started on, or whether he slipped into somewhere else entirely, somewhere the maps don't show and the radio doesn't reach. Wade had picked up his load in Seattle just after sunset, 26 pallets of restaurant equipment headed for a depot in Spokane. It was a straightforward run, the kind he could do in his sleep, Interstate 90 east through the Cascades, about 5 hours if traffic cooperated and the weather held. The dispatcher had warned him about possible fog in the pass, but Wade had driven through worse. He'd been through Snoqualmie in January whiteouts, in spring rain that fell so hard it turned the road into a river, in summer when wildfire smoke turned the sky the color of old blood. Fog didn't worry him. He should have paid more attention to the forecast. By the time Wade reached North Bend, the last real town before the climb into the mountains, the fog had already started to gather in the low places, pooling in the valleys like something alive, something patient. It wasn't the light mist that sometimes drifted across the highway in the early morning, the kind that burned off as soon as the sun hit it. This was the heavy, dense fog that the Pacific Northwest was famous for, the kind that swallowed headlights and turned familiar roads into alien landscapes. Wade could see it thickening as he left the town behind, the streetlights fading into soft orange smudges, the neon signs of the last gas station dissolving into nothing. He turned his headlights to low beam. High beams would just reflect back off the fog and blind him, and settled in for a slow climb. The highway began its ascent almost immediately, the road twisting upward through dense forest, Douglas fir and western hemlock pressing in on both sides. During the day, the trees created a green tunnel, beautiful in that wet, moss-covered way that made tourists pull over for photos. At night, they were just walls of shadow, broken occasionally by the reflective eyes of animals watching from the undergrowth. Wade had his radio tuned to a classic rock station out of Seattle, the volume low, just enough to keep him company without being a distraction. The DJ was talking about an upcoming concert, his voice cheerful and distant, a reminder that somewhere out there people were going about their normal lives, making plans, looking forward to things. Out here, in the fog and the dark, normal felt like a concept from another world. Wade had been climbing for about 20 minutes when he noticed the first set of taillights. They appeared suddenly out of the fog ahead, 2 red points floating in the gray-white murk. Another truck, moving slowly up the grade, same as him. Wade eased off the accelerator slightly, giving himself more following distance. In fog like this, you couldn't trust your depth perception. What looked like 100 feet might be 20. What looked like 20 might be 200. He'd heard stories about pile-ups in conditions like these. Chain reactions that started with one driver following too close, one moment of inattention, one tap of the brakes that cascaded backward through a dozen vehicles until the highway was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass. But something about these taillights bothered him. Wade couldn't put his finger on it at first, couldn't identify the source of his unease. They were just taillights after all. Red lights, probably LED given how bright they were, mounted on what was clearly a semi-trailer. The rig was moving at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. Exactly what you'd expect from a professional driver navigating a mountain pass in heavy fog. So why did the sight of them make Wade's hands tighten on the steering wheel? Why did he feel that old familiar prickle at the base of his skull? The one his grandmother used to call a knowing. The one that had kept him out of trouble more times than he could count. Then he realized what was wrong. The taillights weren't moving the way they should. When a truck climbs a grade, especially a steep one like Snoqualmie, there's a rhythm to it. A slight swaying as the driver corrects for the curve of the road. A visible acceleration and deceleration as the rig works through the gears, finding the sweet spot between power and fuel economy. But these lights were perfectly steady, as if the truck ahead was on rails, moving at an absolutely constant speed with no variation whatsoever. No sway, no adjustment, just a perfect, unswerving climb through the fog. Wade told himself he was being paranoid. Maybe the driver ahead was just that good, or maybe the load was balanced so well that the truck naturally tracked straight. Maybe Wade himself was tired, seeing patterns where there were none, inventing problems out of boredom and too many hours behind the wheel. He glanced at his dash clock, 9:47 p.m. He'd been driving for just over 2 hours, nowhere near his limit, nowhere near tired enough to start hallucinating. His coffee from North Bend was still hot in the cup holder, steam rising from the plastic lid. He was fine. Everything was fine. That's when the second set of taillights appeared. They materialized out of the fog to the left of the first set, another truck running parallel in what should have been the passing lane. Except that on this section of I-90, there was no passing lane. The highway was 2 lanes total, one in each direction, separated by a cable barrier. The westbound lane was on the other side of that barrier, a completely separate roadway, invisible from where Wade was driving. So how was he seeing taillights to the left of the first truck? Wade leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. The fog made everything uncertain, blurring the edges of reality, but he was sure of what he was seeing. 2 sets of taillights now, side by side, climbing the grade in perfect formation, and they were in his lane. Both of them. 2 trucks, running parallel on a highway that was only wide enough for one. His first thought was that one of them had crossed the center line, that he was about to witness a head-on collision between 2 semis and whatever poor bastard was coming down the mountain in the opposite direction. He started to reach for his CB radio to broadcast a warning when a third set of taillights appeared, then a fourth, then a fifth. They emerged from the fog like ghosts, like something conjured from the gray nothing, spreading across the highway in a line that should have been impossible. 5 trucks now, all running side by side, all moving at that same eerie, perfect speed, all climbing into the mountains with a coordination that made Wade's blood run cold. The highway wasn't wide enough for 5 trucks. It wasn't wide enough for 3. The mathematics of it didn't work, couldn't work, but there they were, blazing red in the fog, close enough that Wade could see the outlines of the trailers now, the rectangular shapes emerging from the murk. And then he saw the 6th truck, and the 7th, and the 8th. The taillights kept multiplying, spreading across his entire field of vision, a horizontal line of red that stretched from one side of the fog to the other. Wade stopped counting after 12. There might have been 15. There might have been 20. All he knew was that the highway ahead had transformed into a river of red light, a convoy of trucks that couldn't possibly exist, climbing through the fog with an inexorable mechanical precision that had nothing human about it. Wade's foot found the brake pedal, not a panic stop. Training kept him from that, kept him from doing anything that might send his own rig into a jackknife, but a steady, firm pressure that brought his speed down from 45 to 35 to 25. The convoy ahead didn't change pace, didn't slow down, didn't speed up, just kept climbing at that same constant rate, the taillights glowing like hot coals in the gray-white night. His CB radio crackled to life, startling him badly enough that he nearly swerved. The voice that came through was distorted, broken up by static, but clearly human, clearly male, with an accent that might have been Russian or Serbian or something else from Eastern Europe. "You see them too?" the voice asked. "The trucks in the fog?" Wade grabbed the mic with a hand that was less steady than he would have liked. "Yeah," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, too loud in the cab of his truck. "Yeah, I see them. What the hell is this? Some kind of convoy? Where did they all come from?" Static hissed and popped, and for a moment Wade thought he'd lost the signal. But then the voice came back. "Not convoy," the voice said, and there was something in the tone that made Wade's stomach clench. "Not real. You need to stop. Pull over. Don't follow them." "What do you mean they're not real?" Wade demanded, but he was already easing his rig toward the shoulder, already looking for a place to get off the highway. "They're right there. I can see them." "I know," the voice said, and now it sounded sad, resigned. "I saw them too, 3 hours ago. I followed them. Don't make my mistake, please. Don't follow them into the fog." "Where are you?" Wade asked, but the radio had gone silent, leaving nothing but the hiss of dead air and the low rumble of his own engine. "Hey, where are you? What happened?" No answer. Wade tried a few more times, calling out on the emergency channel, on the main trucking channels, even on the weird channels that nobody used except for the occasional lunatic or conspiracy theorist. But there was nothing. Just silence, as if every other driver on I-90 had simply vanished, leaving Wade alone with the convoy that shouldn't exist. He found a pullout, one of the scenic overlooks that the highway department had carved into the mountainside for tourists who wanted to take pictures of the Cascade Peaks. During the day, these spots offered views that stretched for miles, all the way to Mount Rainier on clear days. Tonight, the pullout offered nothing but fog and darkness, and the faint memory of where the edge of the cliff should be. Wade guided his rig into the space, set the parking brake, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of fog moving past the windshield. The convoy was still visible ahead, still climbing, the taillights beginning to fade as the trucks, or whatever they were, gained distance. Wade watched them go, his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct he had was screaming at him that something was very wrong, that what he was seeing was impossible, that he needed to stay exactly where he was until the fog lifted, and the world made sense again. But another part of him, the curious part, the part that had gotten him into trouble more than once over the years, wanted to follow them, wanted to see where they were going, wanted to understand what he was looking at. Because trucks didn't appear out of nowhere. Trucks didn't drive in perfect formation through fog so thick you could barely see 50 feet ahead. Trucks didn't multiply like that, spreading across a highway that couldn't possibly hold them all. Wade sat in the darkness, watching the last of the taillights disappear into the gray distance, and made himself a promise. He was going to wait here. He was going to sit in this pullout until dawn if necessary, until the fog burned off and he could see the highway clearly, until he could convince himself that what he'd seen was just some trick of the light, some optical illusion created by moisture and darkness and too many hours on the road. He was absolutely not going to follow that convoy into the mountains. He was absolutely not going to find out what was waiting up ahead, past the next curve, past the place where the taillights had vanished. But even as he made that promise to himself, Wade Laramie knew he was lying. Because somewhere up in the fog, past the point where the highway disappeared into nothing, there was an answer. And Wade had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. He reached for his coffee, took a long drink, and stared into the fog, waiting for whatever came next. Wade sat in the pullout for exactly 17 minutes, watching the second hand sweep around the face of his dashboard clock, counting down the time he'd promised himself he'd wait. 17 minutes of listening to the fog move past his truck like something breathing. 17 minutes of staring at the empty highway ahead where the convoy had disappeared. 17 minutes of trying to convince himself that the smart thing to do was to turn his rig around, head back down to North Bend, find a motel room with a parking lot big enough for an 18-wheeler, and pretend this night had never happened. At minute 18, Wade turned the key and brought his engine back to life. The diesel rumbled and caught, the sound reassuringly normal, reassuringly real. He checked his mirrors. Nothing but fog behind him, fog on both sides, fog pressing against the windows like it wanted to get in. The highway ahead was empty now, the taillights long gone, swallowed by distance and the gray-white murk that seemed to thicken with every passing minute. Wade released the parking brake, felt the truck shudder slightly as the brakes disengaged, and eased back onto the highway. He told himself he was being practical. The pass wasn't going to get any clearer sitting in a pullout, and he had a delivery deadline to meet. Spokane wasn't getting any closer while he sat here questioning his sanity. The convoy had moved on, disappeared into whatever pocket of the mountains had spawned it, and the road ahead was clear. There was no reason to stay parked. No reason at all. The fact that his hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, the fact that his heart was beating just a little too fast, the fact that every nerve ending in his body was screaming at him to turn around, well, those were just symptoms of fatigue, of too much coffee and not enough sleep, of letting his imagination run wild in conditions that would make anyone nervous. The highway continued its climb, the grade steep enough that Wade had to downshift, had to listen to his engine work harder, the turbo spooling up with that high-pitched whine that every trucker knew by heart. The road curved left, then right, following the contours of the mountain, and Wade kept his speed conservative, kept his eyes locked on the white line at the edge of the pavement, the only reliable reference point in a world that had become nothing but shades of gray. The fog seemed to pulse around him, thickening and thinning in waves, and occasionally he'd catch a glimpse of the forest pressing in on either side, the massive trunks of old-growth trees appearing and disappearing like sentinels. The CB radio remained silent. Wade had left it on, volume turned up higher than usual, hoping to hear that accented voice again, hoping for some explanation or at least some confirmation that he hadn't imagined the whole thing. But there was nothing. Not even the usual chatter that filled the airwaves on a normal night. Truckers complaining about traffic, warning each other about speed traps, trading information about which rest stops had the best coffee or the cleanest showers. Just static and silence, as if every other driver in the Pacific Northwest had simply ceased to exist. Wade passed a mile marker, the green sign appearing suddenly out of the fog and vanishing just as quickly. He was 32 miles from the summit now, 32 miles from the highest point of the pass where the highway crested before beginning its long descent into eastern Washington. 32 miles of climbing through this soup, through visibility that had dropped to maybe 40 feet on a good stretch and 20 feet everywhere else. He checked his speedometer, 30 miles per hour, slow enough to be safe, fast enough to maintain momentum. The grade was relentless here, a steady 7% climb that ate fuel and tested patience. That's when he saw the first truck. Not the whole convoy this time, not that impossible line of taillights stretching across the highway. Just one truck, pulled off onto the shoulder about 50 yards ahead, its hazard lights flashing orange in the fog. Wade's first instinct was relief. Another driver, another human being, proof that he wasn't completely alone up here. His second instinct was concern, because a truck stopped on the shoulder of a mountain pass in heavy fog usually meant trouble. Breakdown, accident, medical emergency, any number of scenarios that could leave a driver stranded and vulnerable. Wade slowed further, put on his own flashers, and eased his rig up behind the stopped truck, leaving about 20 feet of space between them. He could see it more clearly now, a Peterbilt, older model, probably from the early 2000s based on the body style, painted a dark color that might have been blue, or black, or dark green. It was impossible to tell in the fog. The trailer was a standard dry van, 53 feet long, no markings that Wade could see, no company name or DOT number visible on the mud flaps. The whole rig had an anonymous quality to it, the kind of truck you'd pass 100 times on any given highway without giving it a second thought. Wade set his parking brake and grabbed his flashlight from the door pocket, a heavy mag light that could double as a weapon if necessary. Not that he expected trouble, but 11 years on the road had taught him that caution was never wasted. He pulled on his high-visibility vest, the bright yellow fabric that would make him visible to any traffic coming up behind him, and climbed down from the cab. The fog wrapped around him immediately, cold and damp, carrying that distinctive Pacific Northwest smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation. His boots hit the pavement and he could hear the slight hiss of his air brakes releasing, the tick of his engine cooling, and nothing else. No wind, no traffic, just the fog and the darkness and that stopped truck ahead of him. Wade walked toward the Peterbilt, his flashlight beam cutting through the murk, creating more shadows than it illuminated. The truck's engine was running. He could hear the diesel idle, could see the faint shimmer of heat rising from the exhaust stack, but there were no lights on in the cab, no movement that he could detect. The driver's side door was closed. Wade approached cautiously, calling out as he got closer. "Hey, everything okay? You need some help?" No answer. Wade reached the door and knocked on it with his flashlight. 3 solid raps that echoed in the fog. "Driver, you all right in there?" Still nothing. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open with a creak of old hinges, and Wade's flashlight beam swept across the interior of the cab. Empty. The driver's seat was empty. The sleeper curtain pulled back to reveal an empty bunk. No driver. No personal belongings. No coffee cups or food wrappers or any of the usual detritus that accumulated in a working truck. The cab was spotlessly clean, almost sterile, as if it had just rolled off the showroom floor. The only thing that looked remotely lived in was the CB radio mounted on the dashboard, its channel selector glowing green in the darkness, set to channel 19, the main trucker channel. Wade stood on the running board, leaning into the cab, his unease growing with every second. A truck didn't just park itself on the shoulder of a mountain pass. A driver didn't just walk away from a running rig and disappear into the fog. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He was about to back away, about to return to his own truck and call the state patrol to report an abandoned vehicle, when he noticed something on the passenger seat. A logbook, the old-fashioned paper kind that drivers were required to keep before electronic logs became mandatory. A small, spiral-bound book with a blue cover. Wade hesitated, knowing he probably shouldn't touch anything. knowing this was potentially a crime scene or at least something the police would want to examine. But curiosity got the better of him. He reached across, grabbed the logbook, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with handwriting, neat and precise, recording dates and times and locations. Wade recognized the format. Duty status changes, rest breaks, fuel stops, all the required information that proved a driver was staying within the legal limits for hours of service. He flipped backward through the pages looking for a name, for some identification of who this truck belonged to, and found it on the first page. The driver's name was written in the same neat handwriting, Truman Gaskell. Wade's blood went cold. Truman Gaskell. He knew that name. Every trucker in the Pacific Northwest knew that name, or at least the older ones did, the ones who'd been driving long enough to remember the stories. Truman Gaskell had been a mechanic, one of the best, working out of a small shop in Tacoma. About 3 years ago, maybe 4, Truman had taken his own rig, a Peterbilt that he'd restored himself, that he'd poured thousands of hours and dollars into, and driven it up into the Cascades. The official story was that he'd gone to visit family, that he was taking a few days off, but Truman never came back. The State Patrol found his truck a week later, parked on the shoulder of I-90, right here in Snoqualmie Pass, engine still running, cab empty. They'd searched for him, brought in dogs and helicopters and volunteer crews, combed the forest for miles in every direction. But Truman Gaskell had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. And now, here was his truck, 3 years later, parked in almost the exact same spot, engine running, cab empty, waiting for a driver who would never return. Wade backed away from the door, his heart hammering, his hands suddenly slick with sweat despite the cold. This wasn't possible. The State Patrol had impounded Truman's truck, had gone through it looking for evidence, had eventually sold it at auction when the case went cold. Wade had heard about it from other drivers, had listened to the speculation and the theories, that Truman had staged his own disappearance, that he'd gotten lost in the woods and died of exposure, that he'd had debts or problems or reasons to vanish. But nobody believed the truck would just show up again. Nobody believed Truman's ghost would come back to haunt the highway. Except that Wade wasn't looking at a ghost. He was looking at a very real, very solid truck, sitting on a very real highway with a very real engine that was burning very real diesel fuel. This wasn't a hallucination or a trick of the fog. This was here, physical, undeniable. Wade turned and started walking back to his own rig, moving faster now, no longer pretending to be calm or rational. He needed to get out of here. He needed to call someone, report this, let the authorities deal with whatever the hell was happening on this mountain. His hand was on the door handle of his Freightliner when he heard it, the sound of an engine starting close by, too close. He spun around and saw headlights cutting through the fog, coming from behind Truman's truck, from farther up the highway. Another truck was approaching, moving slowly down the grade, and as it got closer, Wade could make out the shape of it. Another Peterbilt, another dark-colored rig with no visible markings, and behind it, emerging from the fog like ships sailing out of the mist, were more trucks. 5, 6, 7 of them, all dark, all anonymous, all moving in that same eerie, perfect formation he'd seen before. The convoy had come back, and it was between Wade and the only route down the mountain. Wade's hand was still on the door handle of his Freightliner when the first truck in the convoy passed Truman's abandoned Peterbilt. The headlights swept across the empty cab, illuminating the interior for just a moment before moving on, and Wade saw something that made his stomach drop. There was someone in the driver's seat now, a figure, hunched over the steering wheel, shoulders rounded, head tilted at an angle that suggested either sleep or something worse. The figure didn't move as the lights passed over it. didn't react to the sudden brightness, just sat there in that same unnatural position. Wade blinked, convinced he was seeing things, convinced the fog and the darkness and his own fear were combining to create shadows where there were none. But when the second truck's headlights hit Truman's cab, the figure was still there, still motionless, and this time Wade caught a glimpse of what might have been a face pressed against the driver's side window, features flattened and distorted against the glass. He yanked open his own door and hauled himself up into the cab with the speed that would have impressed him under normal circumstances. His hands found the door lock, the window controls, hitting every button and switch that might seal him inside this metal box and keep whatever was out there from getting in. The door locks engaged with a solid thunk that was the most comforting sound Wade had heard in the last hour. He grabbed for his CB radio, nearly ripping the microphone off its mount in his haste. "Mayday, Mayday, this is westbound truck at mile marker." Wade stopped, realizing he had no idea what mile marker he was at, realizing that in his panic to investigate Truman's truck, he'd lost track of his location. "This is westbound truck on I-90 in Snoqualmie Pass. I've got a situation here. I need state patrol. I need—" The CB crackled, and a voice came through. Not the accented voice from before, but something else. Something that made the hair on Wade's neck stand straight up. It was a whisper, barely audible over the static, but unmistakably human. "You shouldn't have stopped," it said. "You should have kept driving." Wade released the transmit button, staring at the radio as if it had just bitten him. He hadn't recognized the voice, couldn't tell if it was male or female, young or old. It had a quality to it that reminded him of wind moving through empty buildings, of the sound his tires made on wet pavement, of things that weren't quite speech but approximated it closely enough to be unsettling. The convoy was still moving past him, truck after truck emerging from the fog and rolling by with that same mechanical precision. Wade counted them this time, forcing himself to focus on something concrete, something he could measure and verify. 7 trucks, all Peterbilts, all dark-colored, all pulling identical 53-foot dry van trailers. They moved in a tight formation, maybe 20 feet separating one from the next, their speeds perfectly matched. No variation, no human imperfection. Just a steady, relentless progression down the mountain. Wade watched them pass, his hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to throw his rig into drive and get the hell out of there the moment the last truck cleared. But something made him hesitate. Something about the way the trucks were moving, the way they seemed to ignore him completely, not swerving to avoid his rig parked on the shoulder, not slowing down, not even acknowledging his presence. It was as if he wasn't there at all, as if he was watching something that was happening in a different time, a different version of this highway where Wade Laramie and his Freightliner didn't exist. The 7th truck passed, its taillights disappearing into the fog, and Wade waited for the 8th. But there wasn't an 8th. The highway was empty again, silent except for the idle of his own engine and the whisper of fog moving past his windows. He sat there, hands still gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his fingers ache, breathing hard, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Truman's truck was still there on the shoulder ahead of him, hazard lights still flashing. But the figure Wade had seen in the driver's seat was gone. The cab was empty again, just as it had been when he first opened the door. Wade stared at it, willing himself to see some logical explanation, some trick of the light or the fog that would make sense of what his eyes were telling him. But there was nothing. Just an empty truck and a growing certainty that he needed to get off this mountain before something worse happened. He was reaching for the gear shift when his headlights caught movement ahead. Not a truck this time. A person. Someone walking down the shoulder of the highway, moving in the same direction the convoy had gone, their gait unsteady, stumbling. Wade could see it was a man wearing what looked like a heavy work jacket and jeans, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Even from a distance, even through the fog, there was something wrong about the way he was walking, a jerky, mechanical quality that reminded Wade of the trucks, of that same inhuman precision applied to a human body. Wade hit his high beams, flooding the highway with light, and the figure stopped, turned. Wade got his first clear look at the man's face and felt his breath catch in his throat. He recognized that face. He'd seen it in newspaper articles 3 years ago, in the missing person flyers that had been posted at every truck stop and rest area in Washington state, in the grainy photo that had accompanied the evening news reports about a mechanic who'd vanished without a trace. Truman Gaskell was standing on the shoulder of I-90, staring at Wade's truck with eyes that reflected the headlights like an animal's, like something that had forgotten how to be human. Wade's CB crackled again. This time the voice was clearer, stronger, and Wade recognized it immediately. It was the accented voice from before, the one that had warned him not to follow the convoy. "You need to listen to me very carefully," the voice said, and there was an urgency to it now, a desperation that cut through the static. "Do not get out of your truck. Do not stop. You need to drive past him, and you need to do it now." "Who are you?" Wade managed to croak into the microphone, his eyes still locked on Truman's figure. "What's happening here? What is this?" "My name is Jeb Holleran," the voice said. "I'm a highway patrol officer. Or I was before." Static swallowed the rest of the sentence, and when the voice came back, it was fainter. "Been trying to warn drivers for months now. The convoy is a trap. They use it to find people who are alone, people who will stop, people who will investigate, and once you stop, more static." Wade cranked up the volume, straining to hear, but the signal was breaking up, fading in and out. "Not ghosts," Jeb's voice cut back in. "Something worse. They're still alive. The people driving those trucks, they're still alive, but they're not." The signal died completely, leaving nothing but the hiss of empty air. Truman was moving again, walking toward Wade's truck now, his pace quickening. Wade could see his face more clearly in the headlights, could see the 3 years of exposure written in the sunken cheeks and the matted beard, could see the way his lips were moving as if he was trying to speak but couldn't remember how. Truman's hands came out of his pockets, reaching toward Wade's truck, and that's when Wade saw what was wrong with them. The fingers were bent at impossible angles, joints fused or broken, moving in ways that fingers shouldn't move. Wade's survival instinct kicked in, overriding the paralysis of fear. His hand slammed the gear shift into drive, his foot found the accelerator, and his Freightliner lurched forward, engine roaring, tires fighting for traction on the wet pavement. He swerved around Truman's abandoned Peterbilt, watching in his mirror as Truman's figure tried to follow, tried to run after the truck, movements jerky and wrong like a puppet with tangled strings. The highway opened up ahead of him, clear and empty, and Wade poured on the speed, pushing his rig faster than was safe in these conditions, faster than was legal, faster than was sane. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50, 55, and still Wade kept his foot down, needing to put distance between himself and whatever was happening back there, needing to believe that speed and distance would be enough to save him. His CB came to life again, and this time it was Jeb's voice, crystal clear, no static at all. "You can't outrun them," Jeb said, and he sounded sad, resigned. "They know this highway better than anyone. They've been driving it for years, decades, some of them. They know every curve, every grade, every place where a driver might make a mistake." "Then what do I do?" Wade shouted at the radio. "How do I get out of here?" "The summit," Jeb said. "You need to make it to the summit. Once you cross the peak, you're out of their territory. They can't follow you down the eastern slope. I don't know why, but they can't. Just keep driving and don't stop for anything. Wade glanced at his GPS, checking the distance. 15 miles to the summit. 15 miles of climbing through fog that was getting thicker with every passing minute. 15 miles of narrow highway with sheer drops on one side and rock walls on the other. 15 miles of hoping that nothing would go wrong with his truck, that his brakes wouldn't fail, that his engine wouldn't quit, that he'd have enough fuel to make the climb. He was doing the math in his head, calculating fuel consumption and grade and speed, when his headlights caught something ahead. The convoy was back, all 7 trucks lined up across the highway, blocking both lanes completely. They weren't moving this time. They were just sitting there, engines running, headlights off, creating a wall of steel and rubber that there was no way around. Wade's foot hit the brake pedal, his hand spinning the wheel, trying to slow down without jackknifing, trying to find a way through or around or past, but there was nowhere to go. The shoulder on the right dropped away into darkness, into what the daytime signs warned was a 60-foot cliff. The left side was solid rock, the mountain face they'd been carving into. And dead ahead were 7 trucks that shouldn't exist, driven by people who were alive but not living, waiting for Wade to make a choice. He could stop, which was what they wanted, what the whole elaborate setup had been designed to make him do. Or he could try to squeeze past on the narrow shoulder, risking a tumble over the cliff. Or he could do the one thing that every cell in his body was screaming at him not to do. Wade gripped the steering wheel tighter, checked his mirrors one last time, and made his decision. He downshifted, feeling his engine's power band change, feeling the turbo spool up, and aimed his truck directly at the center of the convoy. If they were real, if they were solid, then this was going to be the shortest and most violent end to his driving career he could imagine. But if Jeb was right, if these trucks were something else, something that existed in the spaces between real and unreal, then maybe, just maybe, Wade could pass right through them. The distance closed rapidly, 100 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Wade could see the front of the nearest Peterbilt now, could see the chrome grille reflecting his headlights, could see every rivet and bolt and piece of metal that looked absolutely, undeniably real. His hands wanted to jerk the wheel, wanted to swerve, wanted to do anything except what his brain was telling them to do. 10 feet. 5 feet. Wade closed his eyes, knowing it was stupid, knowing a driver should never close his eyes, but unable to watch what was about to happen. He braced for impact, for the sound of metal hitting metal, for the awful crunch of his truck being crushed, for everything to end in a nightmare of twisted steel and shattered glass. His truck punched through the convoy like it was driving through fog. Wade's eyes snapped open and he was past them, the highway clear ahead, the taillights of the phantom trucks appearing in his mirrors, already fading, already dissolving back into the gray nothing that had spawned them. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might actually burst through his chest, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep the truck on the road, but he was through. He was past them. The CB crackled. "Good," Jeb's voice said. "Very good. Now keep going. Don't stop. Don't slow down. Get to the summit." "What about you?" Wade asked, his voice hoarse. "Where are you? Are you in one of those trucks?" Silence. Then, very quietly, "I've been in one of those trucks for 8 months. I pulled over to help what I thought was a stranded driver. That was my mistake. I'm still here, still driving, still trying to warn people. We all are. Everyone who stopped, everyone who tried to help. We're all still here, trapped in this loop, driving the same route over and over, unable to leave, unable to stop." Wade felt sick. There has to be a way out. There has to be something. There isn't, Jeb said flatly. "Not for us. But you can still get out. You're close now. 5 more miles. Just 5 more miles and you'll be free." The highway continued to climb, and Wade drove like his life depended on it because it did. His speedometer held steady at 60, faster than he should have been going in these conditions. But he couldn't bring himself to slow down. Every shadow in the fog looked like a truck. Every distant light looked like headlights. Every sound his engine made had him checking gauges, convinced something was about to fail, convinced the convoy had one more trick up its sleeve to keep him here. 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. The fog was starting to thin, or maybe that was just wishful thinking. Maybe Wade's brain was so desperate for this to be over that it was inventing clear air where there was none. His GPS showed the summit just ahead, less than a mile now, and Wade allowed himself to hope, allowed himself to believe that Jeb was right, that crossing that invisible line would break whatever hold this place had on him. 1 mile, half a mile, quarter mile, and then he saw it, the sign marking the summit, the highest point of Snoqualmie Pass, 3,022 feet above sea level. Wade's truck crested the rise, and the highway began its descent, dropping down the eastern slope of the Cascades, and the fog broke like a wave, pulled back like a curtain, revealing clear night sky above and the lights of distant towns below. Wade let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were still shaking, his heart was still racing, but he was out. He'd made it. The highway stretched ahead, clear and normal, and blessedly free of phantom convoys and trapped souls and mechanics who should have been dead but weren't. His CB radio crackled one last time. Jeb's voice, distant now, fading. "You made it. Good. Now do me a favor, tell people what you saw. Tell them not to stop. Tell them to keep driving no matter what they see, no matter who asks for help. Tell them the convoy is still up here, still waiting, still looking for the next driver who thinks they can make a difference." "I will," Wade said. "I promise." "Thank you," Jeb said. And then the signal was gone, swallowed by distance and mountain rock, leaving Wade alone with his thoughts and the long descent into eastern Washington. Wade drove for another hour before he finally pulled into a rest area, his legs trembling so badly when he climbed down from the cab that he nearly collapsed. He made it to a picnic table and sat down, staring back at the mountains he'd just crossed, at the dark mass of the Cascades rising against the stars. Somewhere up there, in the fog and the darkness, 7 trucks were still driving an endless loop, their drivers trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape, waiting for the next person who would be foolish enough to stop. Wade didn't make his delivery on time. He sat at that rest area for 3 hours, watching the eastern sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray of dawn, trying to convince himself that what he'd experienced had been real and not some elaborate hallucination brought on by fatigue or carbon monoxide or a complete psychological breakdown. The coffee he'd bought from the vending machine had gone cold in his hands, untouched, and when other truckers started pulling in for their morning breaks, Wade found himself unable to make eye contact with any of them, unable to engage in the usual casual conversations about weather and traffic and dispatch problems. He finally called his dispatcher at 7 in the morning, using the payphone outside the rest area bathroom because his cell phone had no signal out here and wouldn't for another 50 miles. The dispatcher was predictably irritated about the delay, started launching into the standard lecture about schedules and contracts and professional responsibility, but Wade cut him off mid-sentence. "I need you to look something up for me," Wade said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Truman Gaskill, Gaskill. He was a mechanic out of Tacoma, went missing about 3-4 years ago. I need to know if they ever found him." The dispatcher went quiet on the other end of the line. Wade could hear computer keys clicking, could hear the man muttering to himself as he searched. Then, says here he disappeared in November 2018. Truck was found on I-90 in Snoqualmie Pass, but no body, no evidence of foul play. Case is still open but inactive. Why are you asking about this? What about Jeb Holleran? Wade pressed. Highway patrol officer. Would have gone missing sometime in the last year, maybe 8 or 9 months ago. More typing, more silence. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, and there was something different in it now, something cautious. Jeb Holleran, Washington State Patrol, reported missing in March of this year. His patrol car was found on I-90, same location as that mechanic, same situation, vehicle running, no sign of the officer. Search came up empty. Wade, what the hell is going on? Why are you asking me about missing persons? Wade hung up without answering. He walked back to his truck on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, climbed into the cab, and just sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. Both names were real. Both disappearances were real, which meant everything else had been real too. The convoy, the fog, the trap that was still waiting up in those mountains for the next driver who made the mistake of being a good Samaritan. He thought about calling the state patrol, about trying to report what he'd seen, but what would he tell them? That he'd seen ghost trucks? That he'd driven through a solid wall of steel and come out the other side? That he'd had a conversation with a missing highway patrol officer over his CB radio? They'd think he was crazy, or worse, they'd think he was involved somehow, and Wade would find himself being questioned about disappearances he had nothing to do with except as a witness to their aftermath. So instead, Wade did what Jeb had asked him to do. He started telling people. Not the dispatcher, not the police, but the people who mattered. Other truckers. The ones who drove the same routes, who faced the same dangers, who might one day find themselves climbing through Snoqualmie Pass in heavy fog and see taillights that shouldn't be there. He started at the next truck stop, a big TA in Spokane where he finally delivered his load 8 hours late. Wade found a group of drivers in the restaurant, men and women he'd seen before on the road, faces he recognized even if he didn't know all their names. He bought a round of coffee and told them his story, every detail, holding nothing back. Some of them listened with skeptical expressions, clearly thinking he'd lost his mind or invented the whole thing for attention. But others, the older ones, the ones who'd been driving long enough to have their own strange stories, those drivers leaned in and listened carefully, and when Wade was finished, they nodded slowly, as if what he'd told them confirmed things they'd suspected but never been able to prove. "I heard about something like that," one driver said, an older woman named Sarah who ran the Seattle to Boise route 3 times a week. "About 6 months back, I was coming through the pass late at night, and I saw this convoy of trucks all driving in formation. Thought it was weird, but I didn't stop. Figured it was some kind of corporate thing, a company moving multiple loads at once. But they were all the same make and model, all dark-colored, and I never saw any company markings." Another driver chimed in, a younger guy who couldn't have been more than 25. "My uncle used to drive that route. He told me never to stop in the pass after dark, said there were things up there that looked like people but weren't, that would try to get you to pull over. I always thought he was just trying to scare me, but now I'm not so sure." Wade spent the next 3 months doing exactly what he'd promised Jeb he would do. Every truck stop, every rest area, every place where drivers gathered to swap stories and information, Wade told them about the convoy. He described Truman's truck in detail, described the way the phantom rigs moved, described the fog and the feeling of wrongness that came with it. Some people believed him. Some people didn't. But everyone heard the story, and everyone knew the warning. If you're driving through Snoqualmie Pass at night and you see a convoy in the fog, don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't try to help. Just keep driving until you reach the summit, and don't look back. Wade's own driving patterns changed after that night. He started avoiding I-90 entirely when he could, taking longer routes that added hours to his trips but kept him away from the Cascades. When he absolutely had to drive through the pass, he did it during the day in clear weather, and he drove fast enough that stopping would have been impossible even if he'd wanted to. His dispatcher complained about the changed routes, about the extra fuel costs and the longer delivery times, but Wade didn't care. He'd rather be late and alive than on time and trapped. The nightmares started about 2 weeks after his encounter. Wade would dream that he was back in the pass, back in the fog, but this time when he tried to drive through the convoy, his truck wouldn't pass through. It would hit solid metal, would crumple and fold, and Wade would be trapped in the wreckage while Truman's ruined face pressed against the windshield, those broken fingers tapping on the glass, that mouth trying to form words it had forgotten how to speak. He'd wake up gasping, soaked in sweat, his hands gripping the sheets hard enough to hurt, and it would take him several minutes to remember where he was, to convince himself that he was safe, that he'd made it out. But the worst dreams were the ones where he didn't make it out, where he stopped to help Truman, where he got out of his truck to investigate, where he made the same mistake that Jeb and all the others had made. In those dreams, Wade would feel hands grabbing him, would feel himself being pulled into one of the phantom trucks, would feel his will draining away as he was forced into the driver's seat and made to join the endless convoy. He'd wake from those dreams convinced that it had really happened, that everything since that night had been a hallucination, that he was still up in the mountains driving the same stretch of highway over and over, warning drivers who couldn't hear him, trapped in a loop that would never end. 3 months after his encounter, Wade was having breakfast at a Flying J in Idaho when another trucker sat down across from him without being invited. The man was older, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and hands scarred from decades of mechanical work. He looked at Wade for a long moment before speaking. "You're the one telling the story about the convoy," the man said. It wasn't a question. Wade nodded slowly, suddenly cautious. "Yeah. Why?" "Because I need to tell you something," the man said. "My name is, well, it doesn't matter what my name is. What matters is that I worked as a mechanic in Tacoma for 30 years before I retired, and one of the guys I worked with, one of the best diesel mechanics I ever knew, was named Truman Gaskill." Wade's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "You knew him." "Knew him well," the man confirmed. "And I know why he went up into those mountains. Truman had a theory, see? He'd been collecting stories for years, stories about trucks that appeared and disappeared, about drivers who vanished, about strange things happening in the pass. He thought there was a pattern to it, thought he could figure out what was causing it if he just had enough data. He told me he was going to drive up there and investigate, said he'd be back in a few days. He never came back," Wade said quietly. "No, he didn't. And when the State Patrol found his truck, I knew what had happened. I knew Truman had found what he was looking for, and it had killed him. Or worse than killed him, based on what you're saying." The old mechanic leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you, I've never told anyone else." About 2 months after Truman disappeared, I got a call on my CB radio at home. I keep one set up in my garage, old habit from my trucking days. The voice on the other end was Truman's. I'd know his voice anywhere. He told me not to come looking for him, told me he'd made a mistake, told me to warn anyone who would listen to stay away from the pass at night. Wade felt his skin prickling. "What else did he say?" "He said they weren't alone up there. The convoy, I mean. He said there were more of them than just the 7 trucks, said there were dozens of drivers trapped in that loop, going back decades. Some of them had been there so long they'd forgotten their own names, forgotten everything except the route. And he said the fog wasn't natural, wasn't weather at all. It was something they made, something they used to confuse drivers to make them vulnerable. "Who's they?" Wade asked. "Who's doing this?" The old mechanic shook his head. Truman didn't know, or if he did, the signal cut out before he could tell me. All I know is what he said right before I lost him. Tell them not to stop. No matter what they see, no matter who asks for help, tell them to keep driving. Same thing that highway patrol officer told you. Wade sat back in his booth, processing this information. So, this has been going on for decades. How has nobody figured it out? How has nobody put the pieces together? Because the people who survive don't want to talk about it, the mechanic said. They think they'll sound crazy, or they convince themselves it was a hallucination, or they just want to forget. And the people who don't survive, well, they can't talk, can they? They're still up there, driving that same route, trying to warn people but unable to make anyone listen. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the truck stop continuing around them, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, the hiss of coffee makers and the beep of cash registers. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Sounds that belonged to a world where highways were just highways and fog was just weather and stopping to help someone wasn't a death sentence. "What are you going to do?" the mechanic finally asked. Wade had been asking himself the same question for 3 months. Part of him wanted to forget, wanted to bury the memory of that night so deep that it couldn't touch him anymore. But every time he considered it, he thought about Jeb's voice on the radio, about Truman's broken face in that headlight glow, about all the other drivers who were trapped up there with no hope of escape. He thought about the next trucker who might see those taillights in the fog, who might make the same choice he almost made, who might end up joining that endless convoy. "I'm going to keep telling the story," Wade said. "I'm going to tell it to every driver who'll listen, at every truck stop from here to the coast. And I'm going to hope that it's enough, that it saves someone, that eventually we tell enough people that the convoy can't find anyone else to trap." The mechanic nodded slowly. "That's good. That's all any of us can do." He stood up, pulled a worn business card from his wallet, and slid it across the table to Wade. "If you ever need to talk to someone who'll believe you, you call that number. And if you hear anything else, if you learn anything new about what's happening up there, you let me know." Wade took the card, looked at the faded print, looked back up at the mechanic. "What if there's a way to stop it? What if there's a way to get them out?" "Then you'd better be damn sure of your plan before you try," the mechanic said. "Because Truman was the smartest man I ever knew, and he ended up just like all the others. Whatever's happening in that pass, it's been happening for a long time, and it knows how to protect itself." The mechanic walked away, disappearing into the crowd of truckers and travelers, leaving Wade alone with his cold coffee and his thoughts. Wade looked down at the business card, memorizing the number, then slipped it into his wallet alongside his CDL and his fuel cards and all the other pieces of paper that defined his life on the road. That night, Wade had the dream again. But this time it was different. This time, when Truman's face pressed against the glass and those broken fingers tapped out their rhythm, Wade could hear what Truman was trying to say. It wasn't words exactly. The mouth was too damaged for speech, the mind too fractured by years of captivity. But Wade understood the message anyway. "Help us." Wade woke up in his sleeper cab, the interior dark except for the dim glow of his dash lights, and he made himself a promise. He would keep telling the story. He would keep warning drivers. But he would also start asking questions, start collecting information, start building his own theory about what was happening in Snoqualmie Pass. Because if Truman could figure out how the trap worked, maybe someone else could figure out how to break it. The fog was still up there, waiting. The convoy was still driving its endless route, carrying its cargo of trapped souls. And somewhere in that maze of gray-white murk and diesel smoke and human desperation, there had to be an answer. There had to be a way to end this. Wade just hoped he lived long enough to find it. He pulled out of the truck stop at dawn, his rig pointing east, away from the Cascades, away from the mountains that haunted his sleep. But as he merged onto the highway, Wade found himself looking at his mirrors, watching the western horizon where the peaks rose against the sky. Somewhere up there, 7 trucks were running through the fog. Somewhere up there, Jeb and Truman and dozens of others were trapped in a nightmare that had no end. Not yet, anyway. But Wade Laramie was patient. He could wait. He could plan. He could gather his information and build his case, and eventually, when he was ready, he could go back to that pass and find out once and for all what was hiding in the fog. The road stretched ahead, and Wade followed it. But now he drove with purpose. Now he drove with a mission that went beyond deliveries and deadlines and the simple act of getting from point A to point B. He drove with the knowledge that somewhere out there people were suffering, people were trapped, people needed help that nobody was willing to give them. And Wade Laramie had never been very good at leaving questions unanswered. His CB radio crackled softly, just static, just the normal white noise of empty channels. But sometimes, late at night when he was driving through isolated stretches of highway, Wade would hear something underneath that static, a whisper, a voice, a warning, and he would listen, because that was what you did for fellow truckers, even the ones who couldn't find their way home. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of morning fog, and Wade drove on into the clear light of day. But he knew the fog would be back. It always came back. And when it did, he would be ready. Clayton Reddick had been hauling loads through the Appalachian foothills for 7 years, and in all that time, he'd developed certain habits that kept him sane during the long nights on secondary roads, where the only company was the glow of his dashboard and whatever came through on the radio. He didn't listen to music much anymore. After the first few thousand hours behind the wheel, even his favorite songs started to grate, started to feel like auditory wallpaper that filled space without adding anything meaningful. Instead, Clayton preferred talk radio, the kind of low-stakes conversation and call-in shows that gave him the illusion of human contact without requiring him to actually interact with anyone. Tonight, he was running a load of industrial equipment from Knoxville to a manufacturing plant outside of Charleston, West Virginia, a route that took him through some of the oldest, most isolated stretches of mountain highway in the eastern United States. These weren't the dramatic peaks of the Rockies or the Cascades, weren't the kind of mountains that made it onto postcards or inspired awe in tourists. The Appalachians were old mountains, worn down by time and weather into rolling hills covered in dense forest, cut through with narrow valleys where fog collected like water in a basin, and roads twisted back on themselves in ways that made navigation more art than science. Clayton's rig, a Kenworth T680 that he'd been driving for 3 years and had come to think of as more reliable than most of the people in his life, hummed along at a steady 55 miles per hour as he climbed into the foothills. The sun had set about an hour ago, dropping behind the ridgeline to the west and leaving behind that particular quality of darkness that only exists in places far from cities, far from the light pollution that turns night into a pale orange twilight. Out here, dark meant dark, the kind of absolute blackness that pressed against the windows and made the cone of illumination from his headlights feel like the only real thing in the universe. The fog started around 8:30, just wisps at first, thin streamers that drifted across the road like silk scarves caught in a breeze. Clayton had expected it. The weather report that morning had warned about dense fog in the mountain valleys, overnight temperatures dropping enough to pull moisture out of the air and turn it into that thick, clinging murk that reduced visibility to almost nothing. He'd driven through worse. He'd driven through fog so dense he couldn't see the hood of his own truck, had navigated by watching the white line on the shoulder and praying that the road didn't curve too sharply. This wasn't that bad yet, but it was getting there. Clayton reached for his coffee, found the travel mug in its holder, and took a long drink. Cold. He'd stopped for gas about 40 miles back, had filled the mug with fresh coffee that was probably already stale when it came out of the truck stop pot, and now it had gone cold on top of being bad. He made a mental note to stop at the next opportunity, to get something hot and drinkable, but the next truck stop wasn't for another 30 miles according to his GPS, and even that was questionable. Out here in the back roads of Appalachia, GPS had a habit of lying, of showing truck stops that had closed years ago or rest areas that existed only on outdated maps. The radio had been playing NPR, some program about the history of coal mining in West Virginia, but the signal was breaking up as he climbed higher into the mountains. Clayton spun the dial, searching for something stronger, and landed on a local AM station that was coming through clear despite the isolation. A woman's voice filled the cab, professional and measured, reading what sounded like community announcements, church socials, fundraisers for the volunteer fire department, a lost dog in a town Clayton had never heard of. Then the tone of the broadcast changed. The woman's voice took on a different quality, something sadder, something that made Clayton's attention sharpen despite the monotony of the information being delivered. The family of Marjorie Fay continues to search for information regarding her disappearance, the voice said. Marjorie was last seen on the evening of October 12th in the parking lot of Boone's Gas and Grocery on Route 60, approximately 15 miles east of Raynell. She was wearing a blue jacket, jeans, and white sneakers. Marjorie is 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighs approximately 130 pounds, and has brown hair and green eyes. Anyone with information regarding her whereabouts is asked to contact the Greenbrier County Sheriff's Department or call the tip line at. The announcement continued with a phone number, repeated twice, and then moved on to other matters. Clayton found himself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, found himself glancing at the mirrors as if he might see someone standing on the shoulder, hitchhiking, waiting. Missing persons announcements weren't unusual on rural radio stations. He'd heard dozens of them over the years, each one a small tragedy, a life that had intersected with the wrong person or the wrong circumstances and then simply ended, leaving nothing behind but questions and grieving families and police reports that would eventually go cold. But there was something about the name Marjorie Fay that stuck with him, something about the specificity of the details, the blue jacket, the gas station, the date. Clayton's route didn't take him through Raynell, didn't take him anywhere near Route 60, but he knew the area generally, knew the kind of isolated communities that dotted these mountains, places where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. If someone had disappeared from a gas station parking lot, there would have been witnesses. There would have been security footage. There would have been something. The fog was getting thicker now, reducing his visibility to maybe 50 feet ahead, and Clayton eased off the accelerator, bringing his speed down to 45. The highway here was a 2-lane road that hugged the side of a mountain, guardrails on the right side marking the edge where the ground dropped away into steep ravines, rock walls on the left where the mountain rose up. During the day, it was beautiful in that rugged, untamed way that the Appalachians specialized in. At night, in the fog, it was just claustrophobic and dangerous. His headlights caught something moving in the mist ahead, and Clayton's foot instinctively moved toward the brake before he realized it was just fog swirling in the light. creating the illusion of motion where there was none. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and forced himself to relax. 7 years on the road had taught him that the mind played tricks during long night drives, that exhaustion and isolation could make you see things that weren't there, could turn shadows into threats, and empty highways into obstacle courses. The radio crackled, and for a moment, Clayton thought he'd lost the signal. But then the woman's voice came back, clear and strong. She was reading another announcement, something about a county fair scheduled for next month, and Clayton let the words wash over him without really listening. He was thinking about Marjorie Fay, about a woman in a blue jacket standing in a gas station parking lot, about the last moments before someone's life changed irrevocably. 20 minutes later, Clayton was still thinking about it when the announcement came through again. Same voice, same tone, same information delivered in the same measured cadence. The family of Marjorie Fay continues to search for information regarding her disappearance. Marjorie was last seen on the evening of October 12th in the parking lot of Boone's Gas and Grocery on Route 60. Clayton frowned. Radio stations repeated information, sure, especially on small local stations that operated on tight budgets and limited programming. But 20 minutes seemed like a short cycle for a missing persons announcement. Usually, they'd space them out more, would intersperse them with other content to keep listeners from tuning out. He made a mental note of the time, 9:17 p.m., and continued driving. The fog was soupy now, thick enough that Clayton could barely see the white line on his right, thick enough that he'd slowed to 35 miles per hour, and was seriously considering pulling over at the next safe spot and waiting for conditions to improve. His delivery wasn't due until tomorrow afternoon, and there was no point in risking his rig or his life just to maintain an arbitrary schedule. The smart thing to do would be to find a pullout, set his parking brake, and catch a few hours of sleep until the fog burned off. He was looking for a safe place to stop when the announcement came through again. Same voice, same words, same phone number. Clayton glanced at his clock. 9:37 p.m. Exactly 20 minutes since the last broadcast. That was too precise to be coincidence, too regular to be random. Someone had programmed that announcement to play every 20 minutes, which meant either the station was operating on some kind of automated loop, or this was deliberate, a specific choice to keep Marjorie Fay's name in the public consciousness. Clayton turned up the volume slightly, listening more carefully now to what came between the announcements. Weather reports for counties he'd never visited, advertisements for local businesses, a hardware store having a sale, a restaurant offering a new menu, a car dealership with no money down and easy financing, community events, church services, high school football scores. All of it delivered in that same professional, slightly detached voice, as if the announcer was reading from a script and had long since stopped processing the meaning of the words. At 9:57 p.m., the announcement came through again. The family of Marjorie Fay continues to search for information regarding her disappearance. Clayton was counting now, watching his clock, waiting. At 10:17 p.m., it came through again. At 10:37 p.m., at 10:57 p.m., every 20 minutes exactly, with mechanical precision. And each time, Clayton found himself listening more carefully, found himself picking up details he'd missed before. The way the announcer's voice wavered slightly when she said Marjorie's name, the emphasis placed on certain words, blue jacket, white sneakers, anyone with information. The repetition of the phone number, as if saying it twice would somehow make people more likely to call. By 11:17 p.m., Clayton had heard the announcement 6 times, and something about the repetition was starting to burrow under his skin, starting to feel less like a public service and more like something else, something he couldn't quite name. He'd driven another 15 miles since the announcement started, had climbed higher into the mountains, and the fog showed no signs of clearing. If anything, it was getting worse, pressing against his windshield like something alive, something that wanted in. The road curved sharply to the left, and Clayton followed it, his hands light on the wheel, his eyes straining to see through the gray-white murk. He was looking for mile markers, for signs that would tell him where he was, but the fog had swallowed everything except the immediate stretch of asphalt in front of him. He could be anywhere. He could be nowhere. The mountains all looked the same in the dark, and the fog erased any landmarks that might have oriented him. At 11:37 p.m., the announcement came through again, but this time something was different. The announcer's voice was the same, the words were the same, but there was something underneath it now, something that made Clayton lean forward and turn the volume up higher. A sound. Faint, barely audible beneath the professional delivery, but definitely there. It sounded like breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, as if someone was running or struggling or... The sound cut off as abruptly as it had started, and the announcement continued as if nothing had happened. Anyone with information regarding her whereabouts is asked to contact the Greenbrier County Sheriff's Department or call the tip line at... Clayton's hands tightened on the wheel. He told himself he'd imagined it, that the breathing had been static or interference, or his own breath echoing in the quiet cab. But he knew what he'd heard. Someone had been breathing into the microphone while that announcement played, someone who hadn't been there during the previous broadcasts, or at least hadn't been audible. He reached for his CB radio, intending to switch over and see if any other drivers were out here, if anyone else was listening to this station, if anyone else had heard what he'd heard. But before his hand reached the dial, a new voice came through his FM radio. Not the announcer. Someone else. A woman speaking directly into the microphone, her voice raw and desperate. "Please," the voice said. "Please. If anyone can hear this, I need help. My name is Marjorie Fay, and I'm..." Static swallowed the rest of the sentence, leaving Clayton staring at his radio in disbelief. He fumbled with the tuning dial, trying to bring the signal back, trying to hear more, but there was nothing now except the hiss of dead air and the low rumble of his engine. The station had gone silent, or he'd lost the signal, or something had happened to interrupt the broadcast. Clayton pulled over onto the shoulder, not caring about safety or visibility or anything except getting his rig stopped so he could focus on the radio. He grabbed the dial and started scanning, searching for the station he'd been listening to, but every frequency he landed on was either static or country music, or preachers shouting about salvation. The local station was gone, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his cell phone from the cup holder, intending to call 911, intending to report what he'd heard, but there was no signal, not even one bar. He was too deep in the mountains, too far from civilization, too isolated for modern technology to reach him. The phone was just an expensive paperweight out here, useless except as a flashlight. Clayton sat in the darkness of his cab, engine idling, fog pressing against the windows, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had he really heard Marjorie Fay's voice on the radio? Had a missing woman somehow gained access to a radio station's broadcast and sent out a distress call? Or was this something else, something he didn't understand? Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up and his instincts scream at him to start driving and not stop until he was out of these mountains. He was still trying to decide what to do when his headlights caught something ahead. A sign, green and reflective, emerging from the fog just long enough for Clayton to read it. Boone's Gas and Grocery, 2 miles. The same gas station where Marjorie Fay had last been seen. The same parking lot where a woman in a blue jacket had disappeared 3 weeks ago, or whenever October 12th had been, because Clayton suddenly realized he had no idea what today's date was, had lost track during the endless days on the road. He could drive past, he could keep going, could put distance between himself and whatever was happening here, could chalk the whole thing up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination and too many hours listening to missing persons announcements. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But Clayton had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing, and somewhere in the fog ahead, 2 miles up this winding mountain road, there might be answers. There might be a woman who needed help. There might be an explanation for the voice on the radio. Clayton put his rig back in gear, released the parking brake, and started driving toward Boone's Gas and Grocery, even as every instinct he had told him this was a mistake. The 2 miles to Boone's Gas and Grocery felt like 20. The fog seemed to thicken with every passing minute, wrapping around Clayton's truck like something with intention, something that wanted to slow him down or stop him completely. His headlights carved out a narrow tunnel through the gray-white murk, revealing the road in 10-foot increments, never enough to see what was coming, only enough to react to what was already there. The white line on the shoulder became his lifeline, the only constant in a world that had dissolved into formless vapor and shadows. Clayton kept the radio on, volume turned up higher than was comfortable, waiting for the announcement to come through again. He checked his clock obsessively, watching the minutes tick by, waiting for the 20-minute mark. 11:57 p.m. came and went with nothing but static and the occasional burst of what might have been country music bleeding through from a distant station. No missing persons announcement, no professional voice reading from a script, and definitely no desperate woman calling for help. The silence was worse than the repetition had been. At least when the announcements were playing, Clayton had something to focus on, something concrete to analyze and question. Now there was nothing except his own thoughts circling back on themselves, trying to construct explanations that made sense. Maybe the station had gone off the air for the night. Maybe their broadcast tower had issues with the fog, with the weather. Maybe Clayton had imagined the whole thing, had let exhaustion and isolation create patterns where there were none, had heard what his tired brain wanted to hear rather than what was actually being transmitted. But he knew that wasn't true. He'd heard Marjorie Fay's voice. He'd heard the desperation in it, the fear, the very real and human terror of someone who was in trouble and running out of options. That hadn't been his imagination. That had been real. The road began to level out slightly, the steep grade easing as Clayton descended into what his GPS suggested was a small valley. Through breaks in the fog, he could make out the darker shapes of trees pressing close to the highway, their branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers trying to knit the forest back together above the artificial scar of the road. This was old-growth forest, the kind that had been here long before highways and truck stops, long before electricity and radio towers, long before people had any business cutting paths through these mountains. A deer appeared suddenly in his headlights, frozen in the middle of the road, its eyes reflecting back at Clayton with that eerie green glow that always made them look alien, inhuman. Clayton's foot hit the brake. Not hard enough to lock up his wheels, but firm enough to slow his momentum, and he watched as the deer finally decided to move, bounding off into the fog with a grace that seemed impossible for something that size. His heart was hammering, adrenaline flooding his system from the near miss, and it took him a moment to realize that his hands were shaking on the wheel. He needed coffee. He needed to stop. He needed to get out of the cab and stretch his legs and convince himself that he was fine, that everything was fine, that he was just a trucker making a routine delivery through bad weather, and there was nothing unusual or threatening about any of this. The sign for Boone's Gas and Grocery appeared ahead, mounted on a post that leaned at a slight angle, as if it had been hit at some point and never properly repaired. The sign was old, the kind that had probably been hand-painted decades ago and touched up periodically ever since. The letters faded, but still legible. Boone's Gas and Grocery. Open 24 hours. Diesel fuel available. Clayton took the turnoff, his rig bumping over the transition from asphalt to gravel, and followed the short access road toward a cluster of lights that glowed orange and welcoming through the fog. The gas station materialized gradually, revealing itself in layers. First, the pumps, old-fashioned affairs that looked like they predated pay-at-the-pump technology. Then the store itself, a low, cinder-block building with a metal roof and windows covered in advertisements for cigarettes and lottery tickets and beer. A single vehicle was parked near the front door, a pickup truck that had seen better days, its paint oxidized to a dull brown, and one headlight held in place with what looked like duct tape. Clayton pulled his rig into the diesel area, a separate island away from the regular gas pumps, and set his parking brake. The sudden cessation of forward motion felt strange after hours of constant driving, as if the world had abruptly stopped spinning and he was the only thing still moving. He killed his engine, and the silence that followed was total, oppressive, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of fog moving past his windows. Through the store's front window, Clayton could see a single person behind the counter, an older man with white hair and glasses reading something, a newspaper or a magazine. It was hard to tell from this distance. The man didn't look up when Clayton's truck pulled in, didn't seem to notice or care that he had a customer. There was something unsettling about that lack of reaction, about the way the man just continued reading as if 18 wheels of truck and trailer materializing out of the fog was the most mundane thing in the world. Clayton sat in his cab for a moment longer, studying the scene, looking for anything that felt wrong or dangerous or out of place. But everything looked exactly like what it claimed to be. A small, isolated gas station serving a community that probably didn't have many other options. The kind of place where locals would know the owner by name, where strangers would be noticed and discussed, where a woman disappearing from the parking lot would be the biggest news in years. He grabbed his wallet, his keys, and his cell phone, still showing no signal, and climbed down from the cab. The gravel crunched under his boots, loud in the fog-muffled silence, and the cold air hit him immediately, damp and clinging, carrying that distinctive Appalachian smell of wet earth and decaying leaves and wood smoke from distant fireplaces. Clayton zipped his jacket up to his chin and headed toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot, looking for blue jackets and white sneakers, looking for any sign that Marjorie Fay had been here. The parking lot was empty except for the pickup truck. No abandoned vehicles, no police tape, no memorial flowers or crosses or any of the other markers that sometimes appeared at places where people had vanished or died. Just cracked asphalt and weeds growing through the cracks and the orange glow of the overhead lights fighting a losing battle against the fog. A bell chimed when Clayton pushed through the front door, one of those old-fashioned bells mounted on a spring that jangled to announce customers. The interior of the store was exactly what he'd expected. Narrow aisles packed with the essentials of rural life, racks of chips and beef jerky and candy bars, a cooler along the back wall stocked with beer and soda and energy drinks, a coffee station near the register with 3 pots of varying freshness. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting everything in a harsh white glow that made the colors look washed out and artificial. The man behind the counter looked up from his reading as Clayton approached, his expression neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. He was probably in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of living in these mountains, decades of hard work and hard winters and the slow accumulation of years. His eyes were sharp, though, intelligent, taking in Clayton's appearance with a single sweeping glance, the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the details that would identify him as a trucker rather than a tourist or a local. "Evening," the man said, his voice carrying the distinctive Appalachian accent, the vowels drawn out and flattened. Nasty night to be on the road. That it is, Clayton agreed, heading for the coffee station. He grabbed the largest cup available and filled it from the pot labeled regular, not bothering to check how long it had been sitting there. At this point, he'd drink motor oil if it was hot and caffeinated. "You must be Mr. Boone." The man nodded slowly, setting down what Clayton could now see was a hunting magazine. "Herschel Boone. This is my place. You need diesel?" "Topped off about 40 miles back," Clayton said, adding sugar and creamer to his coffee, watching the liquid turn from black to tan. "Just needed to stop, stretch my legs. This fog's making me nervous." "Smart," Herschel said. "Too many people push through when they shouldn't, think they can beat it. We get accidents up here, especially this time of year. Mountain doesn't care how tough you think you are." He paused, studying Clayton with those sharp eyes. "You just passing through, or you making a delivery somewhere local?" "Passing through," Clayton said, taking a sip of the coffee and immediately regretting it. It tasted like it had been brewed sometime last week and left to congeal into something that was technically still liquid, but barely. He drank it anyway. "Heading up to Charleston. Got a load of industrial equipment that's supposed to be delivered tomorrow afternoon." "Long way to Charleston from here," Herschel observed. "You took the scenic route." Clayton shrugged, carrying his coffee toward the register. "GPS said it would save me 20 minutes. Didn't account for the fog." He pulled out his wallet, extracted a $5 bill, and set it on the counter. "Keep the change." Herschel made no move to take the money, just looked at Clayton with an expression that was hard to read. "You listening to the radio on your way up here?" Clayton's hand froze halfway to his wallet. "Why do you ask?" "Because you got that look," Herschel said quietly. "The look people get when they hear the announcements about Marjorie. The look that says you're wondering if you should ask questions or mind your own business." He picked up the $5 bill, smoothed it out, and placed it in the register with deliberate movements. "So, which is it going to be?" Clayton took another sip of terrible coffee, using the moment to collect his thoughts, to decide how much he wanted to say. "I heard the announcement, multiple times actually, every 20 minutes like clockwork, and then—" He hesitated, aware of how crazy this was going to sound. "And then I heard something else. A voice, a woman's voice, claiming to be Marjorie Fay, asking for help." Herschel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something that might have been recognition or might have been resignation. "What time was that?" "About 20 minutes ago, maybe 11:40, give or take." "And you came here," Herschel said. It wasn't a question. "The sign said this is where she was last seen. I thought maybe—" Clayton trailed off, realizing he had no idea what he'd thought, what he'd expected to find. A clue? A witness? The woman herself? Herschel was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the counter, his eyes focused on something Clayton couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more careful. "Marjorie Fay was my niece, my sister's daughter. She came to visit me 3 weeks ago, stopped here on her way home to Beckley. We had coffee, we talked, she bought some gas and some snacks for the road, and then she walked out to her car, and that was the last time anyone saw her." Clayton felt something cold settle in his stomach. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Why would you?" Herschel interrupted, not unkindly. "You're just a trucker passing through. Heard something on the radio, got curious. That's natural. But let me tell you something about Marjorie's disappearance that didn't make it into those announcements." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "Her car's still here. Been sitting in my back lot for 3 weeks, waiting for the state police to finish processing it. They went through it top to bottom, looking for evidence, looking for anything that would tell them what happened. You know what they found? Clayton shook his head. Nothing, Herschel said. Not a damn thing, no signs of struggle, no blood, no fingerprints except Marjorie's. The keys were still in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat with her wallet and phone inside. The gas tank was full. Everything was exactly how she left it, except Marjorie herself was gone. Security cameras? Clayton asked, glancing around the store, noting the small camera mounted in the corner above the register. Broken, Herschel said flatly. Had been broken for 2 months. I kept meaning to get it fixed, but things happen slow up here in the mountains. Nobody's in a hurry for anything. He paused, and the regret in his expression was painful to see. If I'd just fixed that damn camera, we'd know what happened. We'd have footage. We'd have something. Clayton set his coffee cup down on the counter, his appetite for caffeine suddenly gone. The announcements on the radio. Who's running those? Is it the police, the family? Both, Herschel said. The sheriff's department put out the initial alert, and I've been paying the local radio station to keep running it every day, multiple times a day. Cost me about everything I have left in savings, but I don't care. As long as people keep hearing Marjorie's name, keep looking for her, there's a chance someone will remember something, will come forward with information. Every 20 minutes seems like a lot, Clayton observed. That's because it is a lot, Herschel agreed. The station manager told me I was wasting my money, that people would tune out if they heard it too often. But I don't care about that either. I care about finding my niece. His hands clenched into fists on the counter, then slowly relaxed. Although lately, I've been wondering if maybe I should stop the announcements, if maybe they're doing more harm than good. Why? Herschel looked at Clayton for a long moment, as if weighing whether to continue, whether to share something he'd been keeping to himself. Because you're the 4th person in the last week who's come in here claiming they heard Marjorie's voice on the radio, heard her asking for help, heard her saying things that aren't in the official announcement, and every single one of them heard it at the same time of night, right around 11:40 p.m., right around the same time Marjorie disappeared. Clayton felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What do you think it means? I think it means someone's playing games, Herschel said, and there was anger in his voice now, hot and bitter. I think someone knows what happened to Marjorie, and they're using those announcements to mess with people, to get some kind of sick thrill out of making folks think they're hearing a ghost, or a cry for help, or whatever the hell it is. He grabbed Clayton's coffee cup and dumped it in the sink behind the counter, then started making a fresh pot. I've called the radio station 6 times, demanded they check their equipment, make sure nobody's hijacking their signal. They swear it's impossible, swear their broadcast is secure, but I don't believe them. Clayton watched as Herschel measured out coffee grounds with shaking hands, the anger and grief and frustration evident in every movement. Have you talked to the police about this? About the people hearing voices? Of course I have, Herschel said. They sent a detective out, interviewed everyone who reported it, tried to figure out if there was a pattern, but there's nothing to go on. The voices are always different. Sometimes it's just a few words, sometimes it's longer. Sometimes people can make out what's being said, sometimes it's too distorted. The only constant is the time and the fact that it happens to people who are driving through this area alone at night. That's a pretty specific pattern, Clayton said. Yeah, well, the detective said it could be anything from a hoax to mass hysteria to people's brains playing tricks on them when they're tired and stressed and hearing the same announcement over and over. Herschel started the coffee maker, and the sound of water beginning to percolate filled the silence. Personally, I think someone out there knows what happened to Marjorie, and they're toying with us. I think they're listening to those announcements and getting off on the pain they're causing, and maybe, just maybe, they're using some kind of radio equipment to insert those voices, to make people think Marjorie's still alive and calling for help. Clayton processed this information, trying to fit it into what he'd experienced. If someone's hijacking the broadcast, they'd need to know when people are listening, when they're in range. How would they do that? CB radio, Herschel said immediately. Lots of truckers run with their CBs on, announce when they're coming through an area, chat with each other about road conditions. Someone could be monitoring the channels, waiting for a solo driver to come through, then hitting them with the fake broadcast at just the right moment to scare them. He poured himself a cup of the fresh coffee, didn't offer any to Clayton. Or maybe I'm completely wrong, and this is all just coincidence and suggestion, and people hearing what they expect to hear. I know what I heard, Clayton said quietly. Yeah, Herschel said. That's what they all say. He took a long drink of his coffee, staring at something past Clayton's shoulder, at the fog-shrouded parking lot visible through the window. You want my advice? You get back in your truck? You get back on that highway and you don't stop again until you're out of these mountains. Whatever's happening here, whatever game someone's playing, you don't want to be part of it. Clayton should have listened to that advice, should have thanked Herschel for the information and the warning, should have walked out of that store and climbed back into his Kenworth and driven straight through to Charleston without looking back. But something Herschel had said was nagging at him, a detail that didn't quite fit. You said Marjorie's car is still here, Clayton said slowly. In your back lot. Herschel's eyes narrowed. That's right. Can I see it? Why? Because I'm a trucker, Clayton said. I've been on the road for 7 years and I've seen things. Strange things, things that don't make sense until you look at them from a different angle. Maybe I'll see something the police missed. Maybe I won't. But if there's even a chance I could help. Herschel studied him for a long moment, and Clayton could see the internal debate playing out behind those sharp eyes. Trust versus suspicion. Hope versus resignation. The desperate need for answers warring against the fear of false hope, of being disappointed again, of letting another stranger poke through the wreckage of his family's tragedy. All right, Herschel finally said. But if you're wasting my time, if you're some kind of ghoul who gets off on this stuff, I will personally make sure you regret it. Understood, Clayton said. Herschel grabbed a heavy flashlight from under the counter and a set of keys from a hook on the wall. Follow me. They went out through a back door that Clayton hadn't noticed before, stepping from the fluorescent brightness of the store into the fog-thick darkness of the parking lot. Herschel's flashlight beam cut through the murk, revealing a gravel lot behind the building where several vehicles sat in various states of disrepair. A tow truck with a flat tire, a sedan missing its wheels, and at the far end, separated from the others by about 20 feet, a blue Honda Civic that looked too clean, too well maintained to belong there. That's Marjorie's, Herschel said, his voice rough. Police said I could move it, but I haven't. Can't bring myself to touch it. They approached the Civic slowly, Herschel's flashlight playing across its surface. The car was indeed blue, a few years old, but clearly well cared for. No major dents or scratches, windows intact. Clayton walked around it slowly, looking at it from different angles, trying to see what the police had missed. But Herschel was right. There was nothing obviously wrong. No broken glass, no signs of damage, just a car that looked like its owner had stepped away for a moment and would be back any second. Clayton tried the driver's door and found it unlocked. He pulled it open and shone his phone's flashlight, useless for calls but at least functional as a light source, into the interior. The smell hit him immediately, that distinctive car smell of old air freshener and fabric and the faint ghost of perfume. The keys were indeed still in the ignition, just as Herschel had said. The purse was on the passenger seat, a brown leather bag that had been left open, its contents visible. Wallet, phone, lipstick, tissues, all the ordinary detritus of someone's life. "Police check the phone?" Clayton asked. "First thing they did," Herschel said. "Last call was to her mother at 9:45 p.m., telling her she was leaving my place and would be home in about an hour. Last text was to a friend earlier that day, nothing unusual. Her GPS showed she'd been here at the gas station, and the last thing she searched for was directions home to Beckley." Clayton reached for the phone, then stopped. "Is it okay if I—" "Go ahead," Herschel said. "Police already processed everything. Took their photos, did their fingerprint powder, all that stuff. You won't contaminate anything." Clayton picked up the phone, pressed the power button, and wasn't surprised when nothing happened. Dead battery after 3 weeks. He set it back down and continued his examination of the car's interior. Nothing in the back seat except a reusable shopping bag and a jacket. Not blue, just a light windbreaker. Nothing in the cup holders except an empty water bottle. Nothing under the seats or in the door pockets or anywhere else that suggested a struggle or a hasty departure. He was about to give up, about to admit that he'd seen exactly what the police had seen, which was to say, nothing helpful, when his phone's light caught something. A reflection, small and metallic, wedged in the crack between the driver's seat and the center console. Clayton reached down, his fingers finding the object, and pulled it free. It was a pin, the kind people wear on jackets or bags, about an inch in diameter. The design showed a stylized radio tower with lightning bolts coming off it, and beneath it, text too small to read in the dim light. Clayton held it up to Herschel. Was this Marjorie's? Herschel took the pin, examined it closely, then shook his head. Never seen it before. She wasn't really into pins or buttons or anything like that. He squinted at the tiny text. "Can you read what this says?" Clayton pulled out his phone again, turned on the camera, and zoomed in on the pin in Herschel's hand. The text became legible. WRVA. Voices reach, voices answer. WRVA, Clayton read aloud. That mean anything to you? Herschel's face had gone pale. That's the radio station, the one that's been running Marjorie's announcements. WRVA 1420 AM. He looked up at Clayton, and there was something in his expression that made Clayton's blood run cold. But their slogan isn't Voices Reach, Voices Answer. It's the voice of the valley. It's always been the voice of the valley. They stood in the fog-shrouded parking lot, both of them staring at the small pin, both of them understanding that they'd just found something the police had missed. Something that suggested Marjorie's disappearance wasn't random, wasn't a crime of opportunity, but something planned, something deliberate, something connected to the very radio station that had been broadcasting her missing persons announcement for 3 weeks. "We need to call the police," Clayton said. "We need to call the radio station," Herschel countered. "We need to find out who made this pin, who's been distributing them, who the hell has been—" He was interrupted by a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere in the fog. A woman's voice calling out, not on the radio this time, but in person, close by, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. "Help!" the voice called. "Please, someone help me!" Clayton and Herschel turned toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the fog, and Clayton felt his heart begin to hammer in his chest. Because the voice sounded exactly like the one he'd heard on his radio. The voice that had claimed to be Marjorie Fay, and it was coming from the direction of the highway. The voice came again, clearer this time, cutting through the fog with a desperation that made Clayton's chest tighten. "Please, I'm lost. I can't find my car. Someone help me." Herschel was already moving, his flashlight beam sweeping across the parking lot, searching for the source of the voice. Clayton followed, his boots crunching on gravel, his own phone light adding to the illumination, but doing little to penetrate the thick blanket of fog that seemed to swallow everything beyond 10 feet. The voice had come from the direction of the highway, from somewhere past the edge of Herschel's property, from the dark stretch of road where the fog was thickest. "Marjorie?" Herschel called out, his voice cracking on the name. "Marjorie, is that you?" Silence. Then, after a pause that felt too long, too calculated, Yes, it's me. I'm here. I can see lights. Please help me." Clayton grabbed Herschel's arm, stopping him before he could run toward the voice. The older man turned, his face a mask of hope and desperation and something that looked like it might shatter at any moment. "Let me go," Herschel said. "That's my niece. That's Marjorie." "Maybe," Clayton said quietly. "Or maybe it's whoever took her, using a recording, using her voice to draw people in." Herschel's expression shifted, hope warring with the realization that Clayton might be right. "You heard what I heard. That's a person out there. That's someone who needs help." "Or it's a trap," Clayton said. He pulled out his phone, already knowing what he'd see but checking anyway. Still no signal. Still no way to call for backup or help, or anyone who could make this situation less dangerous. "We need to be smart about this. We need to—" The voice interrupted him, and this time it was different. This time there was an edge to it, something that didn't sound quite right, like someone reading from a script and not quite managing to inject the proper emotion into the words. "I'm getting farther away. The fog is so thick. Please, I don't know how much longer I can—" The sentence cut off abruptly, ending mid-word, and that's when Clayton knew for certain that this wasn't real. Real people didn't speak in perfectly formed sentences when they were lost and scared. Real people stuttered and repeated themselves, and their voices cracked and broke. This was too polished, too rehearsed, like the missing persons announcement that had been playing on repeat for 3 weeks. "It's a recording," Clayton said, more firmly this time. "Someone's out there playing a recording of Marjorie's voice trying to get us to come investigate." Herschel's face crumpled, the hope draining out of it to be replaced by a fury so intense that Clayton instinctively took a step back. "Then we find whoever's doing this," Herschel said, his voice low and dangerous. "We find them, and we make them tell us what happened to my niece." Before Clayton could respond, before he could argue that confronting whoever was out there was a terrible idea that would probably get them both killed, Herschel was moving again, striding toward the highway with his flashlight held in front of him like a weapon. Clayton cursed under his breath and followed, because leaving the old man to face whatever was out there alone was worse than going with him. They crossed the gravel parking lot and stepped onto the shoulder of the highway, the asphalt slick with moisture from the fog. Herschel's flashlight beam swept left and right, revealing nothing but empty road and the white line that disappeared into the murk. No person, no recording device, no sign that anyone had been there at all. "Marjorie!" Herschel called again, his voice echoing slightly in the fog. "Where are you?" Nothing. The silence pressed in around them, broken only by the drip of water from the trees and the distant sound of Herschel's breathing. Too fast, too shallow, the breathing of someone on the edge of panic or rage or both. Clayton pulled Herschel back toward the gas station. "We need to call the police. We need to report this. Let them handle it." "With what phone?" Herschel demanded. "Yours doesn't work out here, and the landline in my store has been cutting out all week. The phone company keeps saying they'll fix it, but they haven't." "Then we drive," Clayton said. "We get in our vehicles, we drive until we get a signal, and we call the state police. We tell them about the recording, about the pin, about all of it." Herschel looked like he wanted to argue, looked like he wanted to charge into the fog, and find whoever was responsible for tormenting him. But survival instinct won out over anger. He nodded slowly, his jaw clenched so tight that Clayton could see the muscles working. All right, we drive." They turned back toward the gas station, and that's when Clayton's truck horn started blaring. Not the quick tap that drivers use to signal each other, but a continuous, unbroken blast that shattered the silence and made both of them jump. Clayton broke into a run, Herschel right behind him, both of them racing across the parking lot toward the Kenworth that was now screaming into the night. As Clayton got closer, he could see through the fog that someone was in his cab. A figure, silhouetted against the dim glow of his dashboard lights, sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, pressing down on the horn with what looked like deliberate pressure. Clayton's first thought was carjacker, which made no sense. Who the hell would try to steal a semi-truck loaded with industrial equipment in the middle of nowhere? His second thought was worse, much worse, because as he got close enough to make out details, he realized the figure wasn't moving, wasn't looking around, wasn't trying to start the engine, wasn't doing anything except sitting there and leaning on the horn. "Hey!" Clayton shouted, yanking open the driver's door. "What the hell do you think you're—" The words died in his throat. The figure in his cab wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, the kind used for store displays, dressed in a blue jacket and jeans and white sneakers. The kind that looked disturbingly like the description of what Marjorie Fay had been wearing the night she disappeared. Someone had propped it in the driver's seat, positioned its hands on the steering wheel, and wedged something, a piece of wood maybe, between its chest and the horn. Clayton grabbed the mannequin, pulled it away from the steering wheel, and the horn finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, filled with implications and questions, and the sick certainty that whoever had done this was watching, was close by, was enjoying this. Herschel climbed up onto the running board, looked at the mannequin, and his face went absolutely white. "That's her jacket," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's Marjorie's jacket, the one she was wearing." Clayton looked more closely at the blue jacket and felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just similar to Marjorie's jacket. If Herschel was right, it was the actual jacket, removed from a missing woman and put on a mannequin as some kind of sick message. He set the mannequin down on the ground, handling it carefully even though every instinct was screaming at him to throw it as far away as possible, and examined the cab for any other signs of intrusion. Everything else seemed normal. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been moved except for the mannequin placement. Whoever had done this had gotten into his truck. He was certain he'd locked the doors, but locks could be picked, had set up their little tableau, and had disappeared back into the fog. "We need to preserve this," Clayton said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "This is evidence. The jacket, the mannequin, all of it. The police need to see this exactly as we found it." "The police," Herschel repeated, and laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The police have been investigating for 3 weeks, and they've found nothing. Less than nothing. And now someone's playing games using my niece's clothes to—" He stopped, his breathing ragged. "Who does this? What kind of person does this?" Clayton had some ideas, none of them good. Someone who wants attention, someone who gets off on causing pain, someone who knows exactly what they're doing and knows how to stay ahead of the investigation. He was pulling out his phone to take pictures of the scene, documentation that might be useful later, when he noticed something tucked under the mannequin's arm. An envelope, white and unmarked, sealed. Clayton picked it up, felt the weight of something inside, and looked at Herschel. "Should we open it?" "Might be evidence," Herschel said. "Might be contaminating a crime scene." "Crime scene's already contaminated," Clayton pointed out. "Whoever did this touched everything. We've touched everything, and if there's information in here that could help us figure out what's going on." Herschel nodded. "Open it." Clayton broke the seal and pulled out what was inside. A photograph, color, printed on standard photo paper. It showed a woman, Marjorie Fay, Clayton assumed, based on the description, sitting in what looked like a small room or cell. Concrete walls, no windows. A single overhead light creating harsh shadows. Marjorie was looking directly at the camera, her expression blank, almost emotionless, as if she'd been photographed in the middle of dissociating from whatever horror she was experiencing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was written on the back of the photograph in neat, precise handwriting. "She's listening, are you?" Clayton turned the photo over, showed it to Herschel, and watched the old man's face crumble. Herschel reached out, took the photograph with trembling hands, and stared at his niece's face. "She's alive," he whispered. "Marjorie's alive." "This could be from 3 weeks ago," Clayton said gently. "This could be from the night she disappeared." "Or it could be from yesterday," Herschel said fiercely. "Or today. Look at her. She's breathing. She's there. She's waiting for someone to find her." He flipped the photo back over, read the message again. "She's listening. Are you? What does that mean?" Clayton thought about the radio announcements, about the voices people had been hearing, about the pin they'd found in Marjorie's car with the slogan that didn't match the radio station's actual motto. "The radio," he said slowly. "I think it means the radio. She's listening. Marjorie is listening to the broadcasts. And are you? They're asking if we're listening too." "But listening for what?" Herschel demanded. "The announcements are the same every time. I know. I'm the one paying for them. There's no hidden message, no code, nothing that would tell us where she is." Clayton pulled out the pin again, examined it more closely. WRVA. Voices reach. Voices answer. "Maybe there is," he said. "Maybe we've been listening to the wrong thing. The official announcements that run during regular programming, those are the ones you're paying for. But what about the other voices? The ones people hear at 11:40 p.m., the ones that claim to be Marjorie?" "You think those are real?" Herschel asked. "You think whoever took her is broadcasting something?" "I think someone's using the radio station's frequency to send messages," Clayton said. "Maybe hijacking it, maybe with the station's cooperation, I don't know. But that slogan, voices reach, voices answer, that's not random. That's someone telling us that if we listen to the voices, if we pay attention to what they're saying, we'll get our answers." Herschel looked at his watch. "It's 12:07. If the pattern holds, if the voices come every 20 minutes after the first one, then we've got," he calculated quickly, 13 minutes until the next broadcast. They both turned to look at Clayton's truck, at the radio mounted in the dashboard. Clayton climbed back into the cab, turned the key enough to activate the electrical system without starting the engine, and turned on the FM radio. Static greeted them, the hiss and crackle of empty frequencies. He spun the dial, searching for WRVA 1420 AM, but realized that was the problem. It was an AM station, and his truck radio was set to FM. "Do you have an AM radio in the store?" Clayton asked. "Old one behind the counter," Herschel said. "Hasn't been turned on in years, but it should still work." They climbed down from the cab and headed back toward the store, moving faster now, driven by urgency and the ticking clock. 13 minutes, now 12, now 11. Time was compressing, accelerating, and Clayton had the irrational fear that if they missed this broadcast, if they failed to hear whatever message was being sent, they'd lose their only chance to find Marjorie. Inside the store, Herschel went behind the counter and started rummaging through drawers and cabinets, pulling out old receipts and spare change and tools until he found what he was looking for. A small portable radio, the kind that ran on batteries covered in dust and cobwebs. He wiped it off, flipped the power switch, and was rewarded with a burst of static. "Batteries are probably dead," Herschel muttered, but he started turning the dial anyway, searching for 1420 AM. The numbers on the old analog display were worn almost smooth, barely readable, but he found the frequency and let it sit there, static hissing from the small speaker. Clayton checked his watch. 8 minutes until 12:20. They waited, neither of them speaking, both of them staring at the radio as if they could will it to produce answers. The store's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and somewhere in the building, a refrigerator compressor kicked on with a hum that made both of them jump. At 12:19, the static changed, became more structured, more purposeful, and then, exactly at 12:20, the voice came through. Not Marjorie's voice this time, but a man's voice, electronically distorted, pitched lower than normal, every word enunciated with mechanical precision. "Congratulations on finding the photograph," the voice said. "I was beginning to think no one was paying attention. But you are, aren't you? You're listening very carefully now. Good. Here's what you need to know. Marjorie Fay is alive. She's been alive this entire time, listening to every announcement, hearing her name over and over, knowing that people are looking for her but unable to tell them where she is. And why can't she tell them? Because I won't let her. Because this is a test, and tests require specific conditions to be valid." Herschel made a sound, something between a sob and a growl, but Clayton put a hand on his arm, silencing him. They needed to hear this. They needed to hear every word. The distorted voice continued. "You want to know where she is? You want to rescue her? Then you need to understand the rules. Rule 1. Only people who are listening can play. If you involve the police, if you tell anyone else about these broadcasts, Marjorie dies. Rule 2. You have until sunrise to find her. That's approximately 6 hours from now. If you haven't found her by the time the sun comes up, Marjorie dies. Rule 3. The clues are in the voices. Listen to what she says. Listen to when she says it. Listen to how the broadcasts change. Everything you need is there." Static swallowed the voice for a moment, then it came back. "You're probably wondering why I'm doing this. You're probably thinking I'm insane or evil or just someone who wants attention. Maybe you're right. Or maybe I'm conducting an experiment, testing whether anyone is truly listening in a world full of noise, testing whether the signal can overcome the static. Marjorie is my proof of concept. If you can find her, if you can decode the messages I've been sending for 3 weeks, then maybe there's hope for this species after all. If not," the voice paused, "well, we'll see, won't we?" "Wait!" Herschel shouted at the radio. "Wait, you son of a—" But the voice was already gone, replaced by the familiar sound of the missing persons announcement. The professional female voice reading from a script, providing details about Marjorie's disappearance, asking anyone with information to come forward. The same announcement that had been running every 20 minutes for 3 weeks. The same words Clayton had heard a dozen times tonight. Except now he was listening differently. Now he was paying attention to every syllable, every pause, every inflection, because somewhere in this announcement, hidden in plain sight, was a clue. A message. Something that would tell them where Marjorie was being held. Clayton pulled out his phone, opened the voice recorder app, and started recording the announcement even though he had no signal and no way to share the file with anyone. He just needed to capture it, to have something he could play back and analyze. Last seen on the evening of October 12th in the parking lot of Boone's Gas and Grocery on Route 60, approximately 15 miles east of Raynell. 15 miles east of Raynell. Clayton mentally mapped the route, trying to remember if there was anything significant in that direction. Abandoned buildings? Old mines. The Appalachians were full of places where someone could hide a prisoner, full of forgotten structures slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Wearing a blue jacket, jeans, and white sneakers, Marjorie is 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighs approximately 130 pounds, and has brown hair and green eyes. The physical description matched the photograph, matched what Herschel had told him. No new information there. Anyone with information regarding her whereabouts is asked to contact the Greenbrier County Sheriff's Department or call the tip line at... The phone number followed, read twice as always. Clayton wrote it down, even though he already knew it from hearing it so many times. And then the announcement ended, transitioning smoothly into what sounded like a local weather report. Herschel looked at Clayton with desperate eyes. "Did you hear anything? Any clue? Any hint about where she might be?" Clayton shook his head slowly. Nothing that wasn't in the original announcement. But the man's voice said the clues are in multiple broadcasts and how they change over time. "We need to hear more. We need to wait for the next one." 20 minutes, Herschel said, looking at the clock on the wall. "We wait 20 minutes, and then we listen again. And we keep listening until we figure this out." They spent those 20 minutes in tense silence, Herschel pacing behind the counter while Clayton sat on a stool, his mind racing through possibilities. The distorted voice had said something important. Listen to what she says. Listen to when she says it. That implied that Marjorie herself was somehow communicating through the broadcasts, that her voice, the one people had been hearing at 11:40 p.m., was more than just a recording. It was a message, a coded cry for help. At 12:40, the announcement played again. Same words, same format, but this time Clayton noticed something he'd missed before. A slight emphasis on certain words. Last seen on the evening of October 12th in the parking lot of Boone's Gas and Grocery on Route 60. Evening, parking, route. Were those the important words? Or was he reading meaning into random stress patterns, seeing codes where there were none? The announcement ended. Clayton looked at Herschel. "Did you notice the emphasis? The way certain words were stressed?" "I noticed," Herschel said, "but I don't know what it means. Evening, parking, route. How does that tell us where she is?" "Maybe it doesn't by itself," Clayton said. "Maybe we need to collect more data, hear more broadcasts, see if there's a pattern." At 1:00 a.m., the announcement played again, and this time Clayton was certain. The emphasis had shifted. New words were stressed. Approximately 15 miles east of Raynell. Approximately east, and before evening, parking, route. Clayton wrote them down, staring at the words, trying to find a pattern, trying to see what they were meant to spell or indicate or communicate. "This is insane," Herschel said, his voice cracking. "We're sitting here playing word games while my niece is locked in some cell somewhere. We should be searching. We should be—" "Where?" Clayton interrupted. "Search where? These mountains cover thousands of square miles. There are abandoned mines, old homesteads, forgotten bunkers from World War II. We could search for weeks and never find her. But if we can decode these messages, if we can figure out what she's trying to tell us, then we'll know exactly where to go." At 1:20 a.m., the broadcast was different. This time, instead of the professional announcer, it was Marjorie's voice. The same voice Clayton had heard in his truck. The same voice that had been calling for help in the fog. But now she was reading the announcement herself, her voice shaking, clearly under duress. "The family of Marjorie Fay continues to search for information regarding her disappearance," Marjorie's voice said. and Clayton's skin crawled at the wrongness of it, at hearing a missing woman announce her own disappearance. Marjorie was last seen on the evening of October 12th. She continued through the whole script, word for word, but her voice kept breaking on certain syllables, kept catching, as if she was trying not to cry, or as if she was trying to communicate something through those breaks, through the places where her voice failed. Clayton listened intently, marking every place where Marjorie's voice cracked or wavered. There were 5. Evening, again, parking, again, 15, brown, and anyone. Evening, parking, 15, brown, anyone. He wrote them down beneath his previous list, looking for connections, for meanings, for anything that would transform random words into actionable intelligence. Brown, Herschel said suddenly. That's not a word that was emphasized before, and 15, that's new too. Numbers, Clayton said. What if some of these are numbers? 15 is obvious, but what about the others? Could they represent coordinates? GPS coordinates? Herschel grabbed a pen and paper, started writing. GPS coordinates for this area would be… Let me think. We're at approximately 38 degrees north, 80 degrees west. If we're 15 miles east of Raynell… He trailed off, calculating. But that doesn't give us enough precision. We'd need more numbers, more specificity. At 1:40 a.m., the announcement played again in Marjorie's voice, but this time there were additional words stressed. Marjorie is 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighs approximately 130 pounds. 5, 4, 1, 30. More numbers. Clayton added them to his list, his heart racing. This was it. This was the code. Marjorie was using the physical description, her own physical description, to communicate coordinates or distances or some kind of numerical location data. What if it's not GPS? Clayton said. What if it's something simpler? Old-fashioned map coordinates or compass headings? Herschel was already pulling out his phone, then remembering it had no signal. The maps are in my truck. Old paper maps from before GPS. Let me grab them. He ran out to the parking lot while Clayton continued listening to the radio, waiting for the next broadcast. At 2 a.m. it came through, and this time the pattern was unmistakable. Marjorie's voice emphasized 30, parking, east, 5. 30, parking, east, 5. Clayton felt like he was assembling a puzzle without knowing what the final picture was supposed to look like. He had numbers, 5, 4, 1, 30, 15. He had directions, east. He had locations, parking lot. But how did they fit together? Herschel burst back through the door with an armful of old folding maps, the kind that gas stations used to give away for free. He spread them across the counter, his fingers tracing roads and landmarks. If we start at the parking lot here, at my store, and go 15 miles east, his finger moved across the map. That puts us somewhere around… He stopped, his face going pale. What? Clayton demanded. What's there? The old WRVA broadcast facility, Herschel said quietly. The original radio tower and building from back in the 1950s. The station moved to a new location about 20 years ago, but the old facility is still standing. Abandoned, supposedly condemned, but still there. Clayton looked at the map, at the spot Herschel was indicating. It was in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by a narrow access road that probably wasn't maintained anymore, surrounded by forest on all sides. The perfect place to hide someone. The perfect place to keep a prisoner where no one would hear her scream. That's where she is, Clayton said with absolute certainty. That's what Marjorie's been trying to tell us. The broadcasts, the emphasis on certain words, the numbers, it all points back to the radio station. The old one. Then we go, Herschel said, already folding up the maps. "We go now. We get her out, and we end this." Clayton grabbed his arm. "And if it's a trap, if whoever's doing this is waiting there expecting us, then we spring the trap," Herschel said grimly. "Because what choice do we have? We can't call the police. He said if we do, Marjorie dies. We can't wait until morning. He said we have until sunrise. So we go. We go now, and we hope to God we're right." Clayton knew this was a terrible idea. Knew they should find a way to contact the authorities, to get backup, to handle this situation with more than just two unarmed men driving into an ambush. But he also knew that Herschel was right. They were out of options, out of time, out of everything except hope and determination, and the slim chance that Marjorie's coded messages had led them to the right place. "My truck," Clayton said. "We take my truck. It's bigger, it's faster, and if we need to ram our way through something, it's got the weight to do it." They ran out to the Kenworth, leaving the store unlocked and empty, leaving the mannequin in its blue jacket sitting on the ground like an accusation. Clayton fired up the engine, the diesel roaring to life, and Herschel climbed into the passenger seat with his flashlight and his phone, and the folding maps clutched in his hands like talismans. The fog was still thick, still oppressive, but Clayton didn't care anymore. He put the truck in gear, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed east on Route 60, toward the abandoned broadcast facility, toward whatever was waiting for them in the darkness, toward Marjorie Fay, who had been listening for 3 weeks, waiting for someone to hear her message, waiting for someone to answer. The access road to the old WRVA broadcast facility wasn't on any GPS map, and it took Herschel 3 tries with the paper map before he spotted the turnoff, a narrow gap in the trees marked by a faded wooden sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing," in letters that had been painted over so many times the wood beneath was barely visible. Clayton slowed the Kenworth to a crawl, the big rig's headlights sweeping across the entrance and revealing a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in years, possibly decades. Weeds grew up through the center, and saplings had taken root along the edges, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had abandoned. "This is it," Herschel said, his voice tight. "This has to be it. There's nothing else out here." Clayton eased the truck onto the access road, feeling the suspension compress as the wheels hit ruts and potholes. The Kenworth wasn't designed for off-road work, and every bounce and jolt reminded him that he was pushing this machine beyond its intended use, that one wrong move could leave them stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help and no backup plan. The fog was thinner here, or maybe they'd climbed above it, hard to tell in the darkness. But Clayton could see farther now, could make out the shapes of trees pressing in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out what little moonlight might have penetrated the clouds. The road climbed steadily, winding through the forest, and Clayton kept his speed down to 15 miles per hour, not wanting to hit something he couldn't see, not wanting to announce their arrival with the sound of a diesel engine screaming through the gears. Stealth wasn't really possible in an 18-wheeler, but he could at least try to minimize the noise, could at least give themselves a chance to assess the situation before whoever was waiting, and Clayton was certain someone was waiting, knew they'd arrived. "How far?" Clayton asked, his hands tight on the wheel. Herschel squinted at the map, trying to read it by the dim glow of the dome light. "Map shows the facility about 3 miles from the highway. We've gone maybe a mile, mile and a half. Should see it soon." They drove in tense silence, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Clayton found himself thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the scenarios that ended with him and Herschel becoming victims instead of rescuers. Whoever had orchestrated Marjorie's disappearance, Whoever had spent 3 weeks playing psychological games with missing persons announcements and coded messages, that person was smart, methodical, patient. The kind of person who planned for contingencies, who anticipated how people would react, who stayed 3 steps ahead of everyone trying to catch them. And now Clayton and Herschel were driving straight into whatever trap had been prepared for them, with no weapons except a flashlight and determination, with no backup except each other, with no plan beyond find Marjorie and get out. It was insane. It was reckless. It was probably going to get them killed. But what choice did they have? The road curved sharply to the left, and that's when Clayton saw it. A chain-link fence running parallel to the road, 8 feet high and topped with barbed wire, the kind of industrial fencing designed to keep intruders out and valuable equipment in. Beyond the fence, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, Clayton could make out the shapes of buildings, large, rectangular structures made of concrete block and corrugated metal. And rising above them all, a radio tower, its red warning lights long since burned out, reaching up into the night sky like a skeletal finger pointing at nothing. "There," Herschel said unnecessarily. "That's it, the old broadcast facility." Clayton pulled the truck to a stop about 50 yards from a gate that hung partially open, its padlock broken, the chain that had once secured it lying in the weeds. Someone had been here recently. Someone had opened this gate, had accessed this supposedly abandoned property, had done it recently enough that the chain hadn't rusted and the hinges still moved. "We should go on foot from here," Clayton said, killing the engine. "The truck's too loud, too obvious. If someone's in there, we need to see them before they see us." Herschel nodded, already reaching for the door handle. "I've got the flashlight. You got anything we can use as a weapon?" Clayton thought about the tire iron in his toolbox, the heavy mag light he kept behind his seat, the pry bar he used for opening stubborn trailer doors. Not much against someone with a gun, but better than nothing. He grabbed the pry bar and the flashlight, handed the flashlight to Herschel, and climbed down from the cab. The silence when the engine shut off was absolute. No traffic sounds. They were too far from the highway. No animal sounds. The forest had gone quiet the way it did when predators were near. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant creak of metal settling. The old broadcast tower swaying slightly in the breeze. They approached the gate cautiously, Clayton leading with the pry bar held ready, Herschel behind him with the flashlight off to preserve their night vision. Up close, Clayton could see that the padlock hadn't just broken. It had been cut with bolt cutters, the metal sheared cleanly through. Recent work, the cut edges still bright and unoxidized. Within the last few days, maybe within the last few hours. Clayton pushed the gate open slowly, wincing at the squeal of hinges that echoed across the compound. So much for stealth. If anyone was here, they knew now that they had company. He stepped through the gate, his boots crunching on gravel that was less overgrown than the access road, more recently trafficked, and moved toward the nearest building. The compound consisted of 4 main structures arranged in a rough square around the base of the radio tower. The largest building looked like it had once been the main broadcast center, a 2-story concrete block structure with windows on the 2nd floor and a heavy metal door at ground level. The other 3 buildings were smaller, equipment sheds maybe, or storage facilities. All of them showed decades of neglect, their walls stained with rust and mold, their roofs sagging in places where rain had gotten in and rotted the support beams. But one building, the main broadcast center, showed signs of recent activity. The door was slightly ajar, a wedge of darkness visible in the gap. And, more tellingly, there was light coming from the 2nd floor windows. Not bright light, not the kind that would be visible from the road, but a dim, flickering glow that looked like it might be from candles or battery-powered lanterns. "Someone's in there," Herschel whispered. "Could be Marjorie," Clayton whispered back. "Could be whoever took her." could be both. They approached the main building from the side, using the equipment sheds for cover, moving slowly and carefully across the compound. Clayton's heart was hammering so hard he was sure whoever was inside could hear it, could hear the blood rushing in his ears and the ragged edge to his breathing that came from fear and adrenaline in equal measure. The metal door was indeed ajar, its lock mechanism broken, the door frame splintered where someone had forced entry. Or made it look like forced entry. Clayton couldn't tell which. Couldn't tell if this was genuine or another layer of the trap, another detail designed to draw them in. He pushed the door open with the tip of the pry bar, ready to jump back if something came at him. But there was nothing. Just darkness, and the smell of mold and old electronics, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that Clayton couldn't quite identify. He clicked on his flashlight. They were committed now, no point in trying to hide, and swept the beam across the interior. They were in what had once been the main control room. Consoles lined the walls, their surfaces covered in dust and mouse droppings, their dials and switches frozen in whatever position they'd been left in when the facility shut down. Old reel-to-reel tape machines sat on metal shelves, their tape spooled out and draped across the floor like party streamers from a celebration that had ended badly. Papers were scattered everywhere, decades of weather and animals and decay turning them into pulp, but in the center of the room, someone had cleared a space, had swept away the debris, had set up what looked like a modern broadcasting setup. Laptop computer, small mixing board, microphone on a stand, portable radio transmitter with its antenna cable running up the wall and through a hole in the ceiling. This was the source of the broadcasts. This was where someone had been hijacking the WRVA frequency, where they'd been inserting Marjorie's voice into the announcements, where they'd been conducting their sick experiment. And sitting at the laptop, wearing headphones, his back to the door, was a man. He was thin, average height, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie that obscured his features. Clayton couldn't see his face, couldn't tell if he was young or old, couldn't see anything except the hunched shoulders and the way his fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency. The man hadn't turned around when they entered, hadn't reacted to the sound of the door opening or their footsteps on the concrete floor. Because he was listening to something through the headphones, listening so intently that the outside world had ceased to exist. Clayton moved forward slowly, the pry bar raised, ready to bring it down if the man made any sudden movements. Herschel was right behind him, the flashlight trained on the man's back, providing illumination that cast long shadows across the room. They were within 10 feet when the man finally spoke, his voice calm, conversational, as if he'd been expecting them. "You made good time. I was worried you wouldn't decode the messages in time, that I'd have to drop more obvious hints. But you got there. Well done." The man pulled off his headphones and turned around, and Clayton finally saw his face. It was unremarkable in every way, mid-30s maybe, with a receding hairline and glasses and the kind of bland, forgettable features that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. The kind of face that witnesses would struggle to describe, that would never make it onto a most wanted poster because there was nothing distinctive about it. "Where is she?" Herschel demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Where's Marjorie?" The man smiled, a small, satisfied expression that made Clayton's skin crawl. "Upstairs, 2nd floor, room at the end of the hall. She's been waiting for you." He gestured at the laptop screen. "I've been broadcasting her vital signs, heart rate, breathing, body temperature on a separate frequency, just to prove she's still alive. Would you like to see?" "I want to see my niece," Herschel said, starting toward the stairs. "Wait." The man's voice was sharp, commanding, and something in the tone made both Clayton and Herschel freeze. "You should know something first. You should understand what this has all been about before you go charging up those stairs like heroes." "I don't care what this is about," Herschel said. "You kidnapped my niece, you tortured her, I saved her," the man interrupted. "I gave her something she didn't even know she needed. I gave her the opportunity to matter, to be heard, to have her voice literally broadcast to thousands of people every single day. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how many people live their entire lives without anyone truly listening to them?" Clayton tightened his grip on the pry bar. "You're insane." "I'm a researcher," the man corrected. "I'm studying communication, signal propagation, the ways that information travels and mutates and gets lost in transmission. Marjorie has been my test subject, my proof that even in an age of infinite noise, a single voice can still cut through if you know how to amplify it properly." "By kidnapping her?" Clayton demanded. "By locking her up for 3 weeks? By giving her a platform?" the man said. "Every missing person's announcement, every broadcast, every time someone heard her voice and wondered if she was real, that was Marjorie asserting her existence, proving that she mattered, that her voice could reach across distances and touch people she'd never met. I've made her immortal. I've turned her into a signal that will keep broadcasting long after we're all dead." Herschel made a sound that was half sob, half scream, and lunged for the man. But Clayton was faster, grabbing Herschel's arm, holding him back, because the man's hand had moved to his pocket, had pulled out something that glinted in the flashlight beam, a small remote control with a single red button. "I wouldn't," the man said calmly. "This is connected to the room where Marjorie is being held. If I press this button, the door locks and the ventilation system shuts off. The room is airtight. She'd have about 20 minutes of air left, give or take, so I suggest we all stay calm and finish our conversation like civilized people." Clayton felt Herschel go rigid in his grip, felt the older man's fury transmute into something colder and more dangerous. "What do you want?" Clayton asked, forcing his voice to stay level. "I want you to understand," the man said. "I want you to appreciate what I've accomplished here. For 3 weeks, I've been conducting the most sophisticated communication experiment in modern history. I've embedded codes in public broadcasts. I've monitored how people respond to repeated stimuli. I've tracked the propagation of information through human networks. And it all worked. Every single hypothesis I had was confirmed. People do listen when you give them the right signals. People can decode complex messages if they're motivated enough. And most importantly, a single voice, properly amplified, can overcome any amount of background noise." He gestured at the broadcasting equipment. "All of this, all of the technology we've developed to stay connected, to share information, to communicate across distances, it's made us deaf. We're surrounded by so much signal that we can't hear anything clearly anymore. But I proved that wrong. I proved that if you make someone important enough, if you make their voice matter enough, people will listen. They'll strain to hear through the static. They'll decode messages. They'll care." "You could have done that without kidnapping someone," Clayton said. "Could I?" the man asked. "Would you have listened to my broadcasts if they'd been voluntary? Would you have spent hours analyzing every word if you knew it was just an academic exercise? No. You listened because there were stakes, because Marjorie's life depended on someone hearing her message. That's what makes communication real, the cost of failure." Herschel wrenched free from Clayton's grip, but he didn't lunge again, didn't make any sudden moves. "If this was all some experiment, some research project, then you've got your data. You've proved your point. Let Marjorie go." The man considered this, his head tilted slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose that's fair. The experimental period is over. I've collected all the data I need, and you did solve the puzzle. You found this location. You decoded the messages. You did everything I hoped someone would do. So yes, I'll let her go." He stood up from the chair, the remote still in his hand, and gestured toward the stairs. "Second floor, end of the hall, like I said. The door is unlocked. She's probably weak. She's been on minimal food and water for 3 weeks, but otherwise unharmed. I haven't touched her, haven't hurt her beyond the psychological stress of captivity. That wasn't part of the experiment." Clayton and Herschel exchanged a glance. This felt too easy. Felt like another layer of the trap, another game being played. But what choice did they have except to go upstairs, to find Marjorie? To hope that this man's twisted sense of scientific ethics was enough to keep him from doing something even worse. "You go," Clayton said to Herschel. "I'll stay here with him." Herschel hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to see his niece and not wanting to leave Clayton alone with a madman, but need won out over caution. He headed for the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. Clayton stood in the control room, the pry bar still in his hand, watching the man who'd orchestrated all of this. "What's to stop me from taking that remote away from you?" "Nothing," the man admitted. "Except that if you attack me, if you threaten me in any way, I will press this button out of pure spite. I may be a researcher, but I'm also human. I have emotional responses, and right now, my emotional response to violence would be to ensure that everyone loses." "You're going to jail," Clayton said. "You know that, right? The police are going to find out what you did, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison." "Maybe," the man said. "Or maybe I'll disappear the way Marjorie disappeared, the way dozens of people disappear in these mountains every year. Maybe I'll become my own missing persons announcement, my own mystery for someone else to solve." He smiled. That would be poetic, wouldn't it? The researcher becoming the subject, the broadcaster becoming the signal. Clayton heard footsteps overhead, heard Herschel's voice calling out, "Marjorie! Marjorie! It's me! It's Uncle Herschel!" And then the sound of a door opening, and then crying, the raw, gasping sobs of someone who'd been holding everything in for weeks and had finally reached safety. The man heard it too, and his smile widened. Touching. The family reunion. The happy ending. This is what people want, isn't it? This is what makes a story satisfying. The rescue, the return, the restoration of order. He looked at Clayton. "But you know it's not really an ending. It's just a pause, a temporary cessation of transmission. Because I'll do this again. Maybe not here, maybe not with the same methods, but I'll keep conducting my research, keep testing my theories about communication and signal propagation and what it takes to make people truly listen." "Not if I can help it," Clayton said. "You can't," the man said simply. "You're one person. One voice trying to overcome all the background noise of the world. You can tell people what happened here, you can warn them, you can try to make them pay attention, but how long before your story becomes just another piece of static? How long before everyone moves on to the next thing, the next tragedy, the next mystery that needs solving?" Overhead, Herschel was helping Marjorie down the stairs, supporting her weight as she leaned on him, her legs weak from weeks of captivity. Clayton could hear her voice now, hoarse from disuse, asking questions. "How did you find me? What day is it? Is this real?" And Herschel answering in a soothing tone, telling her she was safe, telling her it was over. They appeared at the bottom of the stairs, Marjorie looking exactly like she had in the photograph, thin, pale, wearing clothes that were dirty and torn, her hair matted and her eyes hollow with the kind of trauma that wouldn't heal quickly or easily, but alive, breathing, real. Herschel's eyes met Clayton's across the room. "We need to get out of here. We need to get to a hospital. Call the police." "You should go," the man interrupted. "Take Marjorie. Get her medical attention. Do what needs to be done. I won't stop you. But before you leave, I want you to know something, Marjorie." He looked at the young woman who'd been his prisoner for 3 weeks. "Your voice reached thousands of people. Thousands. They heard you calling for help. They spent hours trying to find you. They cared about what happened to you. You mattered. Your voice mattered. And that's something most people never experience." Marjorie stared at him, her expression unreadable, and when she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than Clayton expected. "I would rather have been forgotten than have been your experiment." Something flickered across the man's face. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment. Or the realization that his grand theory about communication and meaning, and the importance of being heard, had just been rejected by the very person he'd claimed to be helping. For a moment, Clayton thought the man might press the button anyway, might lock them all in here out of spite or frustration, or the rage of someone whose worldview had just been challenged. But the moment passed. The man set the remote down on the broadcasting console, held up his hands to show they were empty, and stepped back. "Go then. Take her. But remember what I told you, this isn't over. The signal will keep broadcasting. Someone will keep listening. And the next time someone goes missing, the next time you hear those announcements, you'll wonder if it's happening again. If I'm out there somewhere conducting another experiment, and you'll listen, you won't be able to help yourself." Clayton didn't respond. He just grabbed the remote from the console, pocketed it, and helped Herschel guide Marjorie toward the door. They were halfway across the compound, heading back towards the truck, when Clayton heard it, the sound of an engine starting, not from the direction they'd come, but from behind the equipment shed where they hadn't looked, where they'd assumed there was nothing. A vehicle pulled out from behind the shed, headlights blazing, and Clayton caught a glimpse of the man behind the wheel before the vehicle accelerated down a secondary road that Clayton hadn't noticed. A road that led deeper into the forest, away from the highway, away from anything resembling civilization. The man was gone, disappeared into the mountains just like he'd said he would, leaving nothing behind except his broadcasting equipment and the questions that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. They made it back to the Kenworth, Clayton helping Herschel get Marjorie into the passenger seat while Herschel climbed into the sleeper area. Clayton started the engine, turned the big rig around, a process made harder by the narrow access road in the darkness and the adrenaline that was starting to wear off, leaving exhaustion in its wake, and headed back toward the highway. It took them 40 minutes to reach the first place with the cell phone signal, a gas station on the outskirts of Raynell, where the owner was just opening up for the morning shift. Herschel called the police while Clayton bought coffee and bottles of water and tried not to think about the fact that they'd let the man escape, that he was still out there somewhere, that everything he'd said about doing this again was probably true. The police came, and the ambulance, and then the state investigators, and Clayton and Herschel spent hours answering questions, describing what they'd found, explaining how they'd decoded the messages. The investigators went to the old broadcast facility and found the equipment exactly where they'd left it, but by then it had been wiped clean of fingerprints, wiped clean of any evidence that might identify who'd been using it. The laptop's hard drive had been remotely erased. The transmitter's serial numbers had been filed off. Even the remote that Clayton had pocketed turned out to be a fake. When the investigators tested it, they found it wasn't connected to anything, wasn't capable of controlling any locks or ventilation systems. It had been a prop, a psychological tool to keep Clayton and Herschel compliant. Marjorie was taken to the hospital, treated for dehydration and malnutrition, and put under observation for trauma. The doctors said she'd recover physically, but the psychological damage would take longer, might take years. Herschel stayed with her, refusing to leave her side, and Clayton understood that. Understood that some experiences bonded people in ways that couldn't be undone, that trauma created connections just as surely as blood or love. 3 days later, Clayton was back on the road, hauling a load of industrial equipment from Knoxville to a manufacturing plant in Ohio, following a route that took him nowhere near the Appalachian foothills, nowhere near Route 60 or Boone's Gas and Grocery or the old WRVA broadcast facility. He'd given his statement to the police, had told them everything he could remember, and they'd thanked him for his help and told him he was free to go, that they'd contact him if they needed anything else. But Clayton knew they wouldn't find the man, knew that whoever he was, whatever his real name was, he was too smart to be caught, too careful to leave evidence, too committed to his research to stop just because one experiment had been disrupted. The man would find another location, another victim, another way to test his theories about communication and signal propagation and the value of being heard. And Clayton would listen, would keep his radio tuned to the local AM stations wherever he drove, would pay attention to missing persons announcements, would listen for the patterns and the codes and the hidden messages that might indicate it was happening again. Because the man had been right about one thing. Once you learned to listen, once you understood that signals could hide in static and meaning could be encoded in repetition, you couldn't unhear it. You couldn't go back to treating radio broadcasts as background noise. You couldn't stop analyzing every word, every pause, every emphasis. 2 weeks after Marjorie's rescue, Clayton was driving through West Virginia on a different route when he heard it. A missing persons announcement on a local radio station. A young man, this time instead of a woman, last seen at a truck stop. Circumstances suspicious. The announcement played once, and Clayton might have dismissed it as routine, as just another tragedy in a world full of them. But then it played again, exactly 20 minutes later. Same wording, same format, same careful emphasis on certain words that might mean nothing or might mean everything. Clayton pulled over at the next rest area, grabbed his notebook, and started listening. Because voices reach, and someone has to answer.